From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $668 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. May 10, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Fans celebrate life of Giant Baba at Tokyo Dome. Pride 5 recap. More. By Observer staff. The final chapter in the career and life of Shohei Baba took place on the biggest show he ever main evented and the biggest show he ever promoted some 3 months after his death. In front of a sellout crowd of 65,000, the 8th largest verifiable pro wrestling crowd in history at the Tokyo Dome on May 2, Baba had his symbolic retirement ceremony. In a strange situation, a few weeks after what may have been the biggest funeral of any sports star in history, the fans packed the dome in what was the final hurrah not only for Baba's legacy but perhaps also for the company he created in 1972, which grew to be one of the biggest and most successful wrestling companies in history at its peak in the 80s and in particular early 90s when it sold out something like 200 straight shows in Tokyo over a many-year period. It was announced as Baba's retirement match, the one he never had, with Baba reforming his legendary tag team with the Destroyer, Dick Bayer, against 2 of his most famous opponents of all time, Bruno Sammartino and Gene Kiniski. Destroyer, Sammartino and Kiniski came to the ring, along with Joe Higuchi, one of the most famous pro wrestling referees of his era, along with American ref Johnny Red Shoes Dugan, who officiated so many of Baba's classic matches. Lord James Blears, the one-time wrestling star more famous in Japan as the longtime president of the figurehead Pacific Wrestling Federation organization, came to ringside as the witness, as he also had done in so many of the legendary matches of Baba's career post 1972 and so many of the other big matches in All Japan Company history. The bell rang and on the big screen they played tapes of Baba vs. Sammartino, the famous Baba vs. Kiniski 65-minute draw from Osaka Baseball Stadium, which is generally considered the greatest match of Baba's career, Baba vs. Destroyer, Baba vs. Stan Hansen, Baba vs. Bobo Brazil, Baba vs. Jack Briscoe, the 1974 match where Baba captured the NWA World Heavyweight title for the first time, and Baba vs. Abdullah the Butcher. The clips by now are etched in memories not only of fans from the era when the matches actually took place, but virtually all current Japanese fans since they've been played so many times on so many different wrestling shows and television specials since Baba's death on January 31 of bowel cancer at the age of 61. The ceremony ended when Motoko Baba came to the ring and put Baba's huge wrestling boots in the center of the ring, and they had a 10-bell salute in front of a standing ovation. With the death of Baba and the departure of Jumbo Tsuruta, the 2 company stars with the biggest mainstream names, who is now attending college in Portland, it was the symbolic end of the company that relies of legacy and history more than any other's ties to its original roots in the early 1970s. Make no mistake about it. It was the ceremony and the final respects for Baba in death that sold out the Tokyo Dome, something that neither Baba the legendary wrestler, or Baba the highly respected and oftentimes brilliant promoter was never able to do in life. The crowd trailed only 2 of the most legendary shows in Japanese mat history, the April 4, 1998 retirement ceremony for Antonio Inoki, which packed 70,000 fans, and the October 9, 1995 interpromotional world title meeting of Keiji Muto vs. Nobuhiko Takada, which drew 67,000 to the same building. New Japan also promoted 2 other shows in the building that drew 65,000, the April 29, 1996 match with Takada vs. Shinya Hashimoto, and the January 4, 1998 show headlined by Muto vs. Kensuke Sasaki. After the show, it was announced that Baba had also received a letter of thanks from the Ministry of Education in Japan for his work in promoting of pro wrestling as a sport. In the ring, the big story was that on Baba's biggest show, his biggest modern protege, Mitsuharu Misawa, regained the Triple Crown for a record 5th time, breaking the record he shared with Stan Hansen by pinning Vader in 1807 of what was reported as the best match on the show. Although that appeared to be the plan going in for months, the result surprised a lot of people who felt that Vader should have retained the title since Misawa won their first ever meeting on March 28, and there is still a fresh matchup and natural story with Vader defending against Toshiaki Kawada, who broke his arm beating Misawa for the title on January 22 in the final pro wrestling match Baba ever saw, and never lost the title in the ring, as opposed to Misawa vs. Kawada, one of the great rivalries in mat history, but a match which has been done nearly 24 times. Still, one can argue long-term, but the short-term decision probably was that this was a show devoted to Baba, and the biggest show in company history, and it should end with Baba's protege capturing Baba's created world title. All Japan has scheduled a press conference for May 7 to announce its new organizational hierarchy. There has been a power struggle between Misawa and Motoko Baba over control of the company. Mrs. Baba has the financial deep pockets to run the company and owns the majority of stock in the company, while Misawa, who owns no stock outright, has the support of the wrestlers. At this point it appears that Mitsuo Momota, a prelim wrestler, is actually running the business as an emissary of Motoko, although it is believed that Misawa will be announced as new president of the company at the press conference. There is also nothing definite about future signings of WWF castoffs the Road Warriors and Steve Williams, who all appeared on this show and were both part of winning 6-man tag matches. Logic would indicate the Warriors wanting to at least temporarily wrestle as regulars in Japan, the last place where their 80s name still means something and where fans are more forgiving of childhood legends that have lost a step, or 4, in the ring. Williams had made no bones about wanting to return full-time to his old job after the WWF made it clear they weren't going to use him any longer after luring him away from All Japan, where he was the top foreign star before Vader came this year, with a 3-year big money contract and a push to top heel status against his namesake Steve Austin that never got off the ground. The Baba ceremony and Misawa vs. Vader match aired later that evening on NTV as part of a 1-hour special. The other top matches will air in upcoming weeks. In a story that got some, but not a great deal of media play, there was a plan on the table for a Toshiaki Kawada vs. Shinya Hashimoto match for this show. New Japan felt that this was both the time and the place to get the ball rolling on New Japan vs. All Japan matches that would pick up interest at a time when wrestling's popularity in Japan has faded. NTV was all for the match as well, figuring it would be great for television ratings. However, Motoko Baba turned down the proposal, feeling that the show was going to sell out without outside help from New Japan. Most accounts have listed this card as a very good show. 1. Tsuyoshi Kikuchi and Masamichi Marufuji beat Makoto Hashi and Grand Naniwa in 15:25 when Kikuchi pinned Hashi after a Thunderfire powerbomb. 2. Satoru Asako and Takeshi Morishima beat Kentaro Shiga and Yoshinobu Kanemaru in 13:22 when Asako pinned Kanemaru using Asako's version of a tombstone piledriver called the SDA, which is similar to a Michinoku driver. 3. In the traditional Baba comedy match, Giant Kimala 2, Ben Peacock, and Jun Izumida, Ryuma Izumida, and Haruka Eigen beat Masao Inoue and Mitsuo Momota and Rusher Kimura Masao Kimura in 14:03 when Kimala 2 pinned Inoue after a flying clothesline off the top rope. 4. Johnny Smith, Sean Hindley, and Tamon Honda and Masanobu Fuchi won an interpromotional match over the FMW trio of Gedo, Kiri Takayama, and Yukihiro Kanemura and Koji Nakagawa when Honda pinned Gedo in 14:41. 5. In what on paper sounded like the interpromotional show stealer, the All Japan trio of Yoshinari Ogawa and Masahito Kakihara and Manukiya Mossman went to a 30-minute draw against Hayabusa, Eiji Izaki, from FMW teaming with Great Sasuke, Masanori Murakawa, and Tiger Mask, the fourth from Michinoku Pro. There may have been a style clash because the All Japan team is a more solid hard-style team and the other team is more of a high-flying team, but we heard this was a very good match. In what must have been an interesting political decision, Sasuke came to the ring on All Japan's biggest card, wearing both the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Tag Team title belt that he holds in New Japan with Jushin Liger, and the NWA World Middleweight title belt. They did an angle during the match where Hayabusa ducked and Kakihara punched Ogawa by accident. After the match, when everyone was shaking hands, Ogawa refused and instead attacked Kakihara. Kakihara then left with Sasuke. The Baba retirement ceremony took place after the Hot Juniors match. 6. Steve Williams and Stan Hansen and Akira Taue beat Gary Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Mori in 16:10 when Hansen pinned Takayama after a lariat. This finish makes a lot of sense in that so many older fans came to this show because of Baba, and Hansen was the legend from that time period, and him pinning Takayama makes sense because as bad as they both are, they have this weird good chemistry together because of the idea of the legendary Hansen facing a big guy with a supposed shooter background coming from the UWFI group. During the match as a tribute to Baba, Taue used Baba's old coconut crush. 7. Toshiaki Kawada, in his first match back since winning the Triple Crown and breaking his arm on January 22, pinning Hiroshi Hazi in 20:55. It was Hazi's first match back since January as well, as he's serving full-time in the Japanese Congress. Most of the match saw Hazi work on Kawada's bad arm and also his legs. Hazi did a 21-rep giant swing along with his Uranagi suplex. Hazi popularized this move in the early 90s after it was brought to New Japan as a move out of Soviet judo by Shota Chakayashvili and is now well known in the US as the rock bottom, his trademark Northern Lights suplex, etc. before Kawada scored the pin after 3 high kicks to the face. This was said to have been a great match, with Kawada coming in lighter and in better condition than before, and Hazi in surprisingly good shape considering he's just days from his 38th birthday and hasn't worked full-time in wrestling in many years, having become a famous politician. In his heyday as a pro wrestler, Hazi was one of the greatest in-ring workers in the business. 8. Johnny Ace, John Laurinaitis, and the Road Warriors, Michael Hegstrand and Joe Laurinaitis, defeated Hakushi, Kensuke Shinzaki, and Jun Akiyama and Kenta Kobashi in 1737. I believe this was either the first or only the second time ever that Ace had formed a trio with the Road Warriors. There was a match in All Japan many years back, but I'm not sure if it was Hawk or John and Joe's brother Mark that was the third member of the team in that match. Of course, the Road Warriors were over big after having not appeared in All Japan in close to 10 years. The finish saw them do the double impact Doomsday Device on Hakushi, although they actually messed up the finishing move the first time they tried it. 9. Mitsuharu Misawa pinned Vader, Leon White, in 1807, to try the Triple Crown. Vader threw his bombs in the corner early, which ended up swelling up Misawa's eye. He continued on offense early, pounding him with clotheslines and elbows, scoring a few near falls along the way. Vader rammed Misawa into the post and power-bombed him on the floor, followed by a splash on the floor. Inside the ring, Vader delivered a lariat and 2 brainbusters, followed by another splash for a near fall. Misawa made his comeback, built around elbows and a missile dropkick. Vader did what was reported as a killer German suplex, followed by an elbow off the ropes for a great near fall. Misawa came back with an enzujiri, but was cut off with a series of big moves, a German suplex, a power bomb, and 2 more German suplexes, followed by the Big Van Crush and even Misawa's own Tiger Driver for near falls. Vader missed a moonsault. Misawa used a brainbuster off the top rope and a splash off the top, a DDT off the top, and a rolling elbow drop for a near fall. Vader came back with a clothesline and a hip drop, sitting splash. Misawa made another comeback with a series of elbows, followed by the running elbow smash for the pin to end the show. Jos LeDuc, one of the most powerful wrestlers of his generation, best known for a lengthy program in Florida with Dusty Rhodes and perhaps an even more memorable recurring role in Tennessee working with Jerry Lawler, passed away in an Atlanta hospital on May 1st at the age of 54. Billed in his prime as one of the strongest men in the world, although he had no weightlifting credentials to back up the claim as have others in wrestling with the same billing, LeDuc played the role of a thick, powerful, and in later years, totally psychotic Canadian lumberjack almost to perfection. His out-of-the-ring angles in Memphis in particular are remembered vividly to this day by area fans, even though some of them date back now more than 20 years. They were replayed on highlight shows and on his return appearances so many times they are part of the Memphis wrestling landscape, through his final appearance in the ring in 1995. The most famous was in 1978, when he, on live Memphis television, and this was replayed throughout the world in every territory he appeared for more than 15 years, took a sharp axe, and showed how sharp it was by having it sliced through paper, and legitimately carved several deep cuts in his arm high on the forearm, saying he was taking a lumberjack blood oath and giving himself a scar he'd have for life as a promise he'd remember every time he looked at himself, finished the career of Lawler. Even as late as this past year in Power Pro, when Carl LeDuc, billed as his nephew although in actuality no relation, came to the territory, Randy Hales ordered him to take a blood oath like Josen when he wouldn't. Hales proclaimed that he wasn't a real lumberjack, and even the afternoon of his death during an interview when Dundee was talking about the guys he had beaten that had come into Memphis over the past 20-plus years, the first name he brought up was LeDuc. Jos and I drew a lot of money, Lawler remembered. We drew as much money with him as with any big name heel who ever came through here. He was one of the people like Austin Idol, Jimmy Valiant and Jackie Fargo that everyone remembered. When we brought him back for Memphis Memories, in 1995, the crowd reacted like he'd never left. LeDuc is generally remembered along with Terry Funk as one of Lawler's 2 hottest rivals during the nearly 3 decades he was the top draw in his territory. Among his other crazy stunts were in and out of the ring angle, breaking a thick vase over his head, bleeding profusely from the forehead while rolling his eyes psychotically, saying that he wasn't crazy, the night he press-slammed Lawler over his head and threw him out of the ring onto a table, which at the time was considered an unbelievable bump, and later losing an arm wrestling match with Lawler allowing his hand to be put down on a burning candle. He also did strongman and stuntman stunts in most territories he'd debut in to get himself over as a powerhouse. Among those type of stunts were allowing wrestlers to literally break a brick over his head with a sledgehammer. He did the stunt in many territories, but did it one time too many as he broke 3 vertebrae in his neck and underwent several neck operations to repair the damage. bracing himself against a wall, locking his legs against a car bumper in a stunt that wasn't gimmicked, and allowing someone to start the car, and his locked-out power would keep the car from moving as the wheels spun and smoke flew from the tires, which was absolutely killer on the knees, and locking his hands together to prove the strength of his finishing bear hug hold, and allowing as many as 5 men who weren't part of the act on each arm pull on a harness attached to each arm to try and break his grip, which they weren't able to do, and do things like tow a large bus. His toughness was legendary in wrestling. Late in his career, he bore a huge scar on his chest as a result of a fight in a restaurant, which resulted in him being stabbed with a steak knife and needing 100 stitches to close the wound. He didn't miss one booking wrestling the next night. Born Michel Pigeon in a small village north of Montreal in late 1944, Leduc had been in poor health for a number of years since leaving the wrestling scene in 1989 and becoming something of a recluse, suffering from a severe case of diabetes. Late last year, he had collapsed on a sidewalk and in the fall, broke 2 ribs, one of which punctured a lung. He'd suffered numerous complications from that and the diabetes, and regularly needed his lungs drained when infection set in, and he had dropped approximately 150 pounds over the past year plus and looked old well beyond his years. About 2 weeks ago, he went to the garage where former wrestler and promoter Gino Brito worked and saw Brito's son, who didn't even recognize him. His son said that he looked to be about 175 pounds with a long white beard and looked very sick and beaten up, and said he had come to say goodbye, since he was in bad health and leaving for Atlanta. He had flown to Atlanta to visit his son and passed away due to the various health problems. The last thing anyone would have figured was for Jos Leduc to ever go out as a frail, sickly old man. Leduc did little wrestling in the ring but was a 100% gimmick. Crazy and powerful and totally believable in his role. He worked as a singles headliner, bouncing from one southern territory to another for most of the 1970s after starting his career as part of a tag team with Paul Leduc, who he wasn't related to in real life. He was mainly a babyface powerhouse, an updated version of Yukon Eric, a huge Canadian star of the 50s, the strongman in jeans and a thick plaid lumberjack shirt, until the late 70s, when he turned heel and added the craziness to his routine. He got over particularly strong in Florida in the early 70s, when he arrived in the state with Paul as a babyface tag team from Montreal. He got over unusually well, and Paul was injured and sent home, allowing Jos to be programmed as the kick-ass power babyface in a territory filled with smaller heavyweights mostly known for being great wrestlers. His feud with a heel Dusty Rhodes put him on the map, and he was always a main eventer when he would return to Florida. Leduc, quiet and strong, at least that early 70s television incarnation of him, made the perfect face foil for the outrageous Rhodes, at the time the territory's top heel. Because he went with the French-Canadian spelling of Jos, short for Joseph, but pronounced Joe, Rhodes used to knock him and always refer to him as Josie Leduc. Years later they formed a tag team, and after that, Leduc turned heel for the first time to once again work against Rhodes. At about 6'2.5" and 290 pounds in his prime, while not cut, except for one period in the mid-80s when undoubtedly he discovered what everyone else had learned by then, and with his natural mass he really looked frightening. He had tremendous thickness in the chest, shoulders, back and thighs, which was a rarity in the days before wrestlers overdosed on steroids. He had decent mobility and threw a good dropkick for a man of his size, but most of his offense was limited to powerful forearms, and he didn't sell much. Michel Pigeon was a policeman working the North Shore of Quebec and ran a judo studio, and had wanted to be a pro wrestler after being a fan from childhood. After his parents separated, he bounced between his mother, various relatives, and orphanages. According to Paul Leduc, who played his smaller brother, the two met in 1965 in Montreal. Paul Leduc, that was his real name, was a 195-pound man trying to make a name in a big man's game. He became friends with the big policeman who would attend the matches. Going nowhere in Montreal, Paul Leduc left for Mexico, where his size wouldn't be a detriment, and wound up in 1968 wrestling for Don Owen in Portland. Owen told Paul that because of his size, he'd never make it in wrestling unless he was part of a tag team. Paul called Pigeon to start training and had some promotional tapes made. Paul and Owen arranged for a strong build-up after Paul described the size and power of his huge friend. Every week Paul would get destroyed by the local heels and vow revenge when his big brother chopped his way across the continent. Jack Britton, a Montreal promoter, who also saw potential in Pigeon, trained him. They cut 8 vignettes with him, which they sent to Owen for use on his television shows, at a time when such things weren't done, of an angry lumberjack in the woods wearing a toque and a checkered jacket chopping trees, claiming that he was chopping his way to Portland. Owen loved the tapes, and Paul called Pigeon and told him to quit his job on the police force. The vignettes played every week on Portland Wrestling and got Jos over big to the crowd from the moment he arrived. They later went to Detroit to work for the Sheik underneath before becoming huge stars in their native Montreal. They were brought in as heels, but the crowds began cheering them anyway, and they were switched faces to work against the like of Mad Dog and Butcher Vachon, Mad Dog, and Killer Kowalski, Jacques and Johnny Rojo and their most famous rivals, the Hollywood Blondes managed by Sir Oliver Humperdinck, battling for the Grand Prix World Tag Team titles. Their first appearance was at the Paul Soif Center as the two did a run-in during a world title match between champion Johnny Rojo and challenger Waldo von Erich. Rojo was a bloody mess and the fans started throwing chairs, remembered Paul, now 62, who wrestled on and off with Jos until retiring after suffering a heart attack in 1978 while wrestling in Florida. It took a squad of police to break it up, and we had to have a reporter smuggle us out of the arena in the trunk of his car. Fans destroyed Paul's car, which he had to leave behind, turning it upside down and smashing out the windows. A month later, we had a match against Johnny and Jacques Sr. Rojo. The crowd cheered us like we were the baby faces. I still don't know why. It was embarrassing for Bob Langevin, who was promoting. During the early and mid-70s, he rotated between various southern territories, with he and his family living in Atlanta, and trips back to Quebec, always as a face. He gained even more of a mainstream name in Quebec, appearing as himself in a commercial for O. Henry Candy Bars. He debuted in Memphis in 1978 and became one of that territory's most legendary heels, first teaming with Gene Louis, Neil Hangman Guy, against Lawler and Bill Dundee. Like with his brother, he got over far stronger and soon was the top singles heel in the territory for a lengthy period of time, including a period where he and Lawler as the top stars on top average drawing more than $7,500 paid every Monday night at the Mid-South Coliseum over a one-year period. He also worked AWA Los Angeles, the Carolinas, Puerto Rico, Pittsburgh and Japan as a top-of-the-card performer before largely ending his career after a very short and forgettable stint using the name of the Headbanger around 1989, meaning something entirely different from what it means today. In the WWF, a role that never got off the ground or out of the first matches, although by this point he was in his mid-40s, had lost his mobility due to operations on both knees and elbows and had ballooned to about 350 pounds. With the new generation of juiced-up performers, a burly older man with a huge belly was hardly going to get over. For the most part he retired in 1989 and disappeared, although he made a few comebacks over the next few years in Memphis and Puerto Rico. Over the past several years he was living in Montreal and had little if any connection to the substantial wrestling community in that city, and many wondered if he was even still alive. When Jim Cornette started Smoky Mountain Wrestling, one of his goals from the start was to bring LeDuc, one of his childhood heroes, back for one last run in the Knoxville area, which was another of the southern territories where fans remembered him years after he had last appeared. LeDuc, however, had disappeared and literally nobody could find him. As it turned out, Hale somehow found him and booked him for two major nostalgia cards in Memphis and Louisville in 1995 to work against Lawler in tag team matches, which wound up being his final matches. Cornette was going to bring him in for Thanksgiving shows and push the hell out of the return of LeDuc on his television leading up to it, but LeDuc's diabetes flared up and he never made the dates. Jos was a big pussycat outside the ring, and for him, life was too much of a party, said Gino Brito to the Montreal Gazette. He went crazy for a while and didn't take care of himself. He was a diabetic and his blood sugar sometimes went off the scale, it was so high. With Raw on May 3rd pushing a lineup worthy of a major pay-per-view show, even if a lot of what was pushed was never really delivered, and Nitro turning into a disaster area, the difference in the ratings between the two shows set records. Raw finished with a 6.38 rating, 5.86 first hour, 6.89 seconds hour, and a 9.4 share to Nitro's 3.39 rating, 3.98 first hour, 3.44 seconds hour, 2.80 third hour, and a 5.1 share. The final hour of the show saw Raw set an all-time record for any hour in the history of the Monday Night Wars. Nitro's third hour was conversely the lowest rated hour for that show in a few years. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes, Raw more than doubled Nitro with a 6.38 to a 3.10. There was never a competitive quarter-hour period, with Raw opening with a 5.4 to 3.7 lead and expanding that lead as it put on the far better show. Raw broke all-time viewership records for a quarter hour during the seventh quarter of the show, with the finish of Shamrock vs. Triple H and the Big Show vs. Undertaker match doing a 7.32 rating, breaking the all-time competitive quarter-hour record of a 7.23 set last October for the Diamond Dallas Page vs. Bill Goldberg pay-per-view match, which was cut off early. That quarter more than tripled the audience of Nitro, which did a scary 2.38 quarter with a Page interview and a Booker T vs. Hennig match. Actually, the 5-minute overrun, which was also competitive, featuring the 26 seconds Rock vs. Austin non-match and lengthy series of run-ins, drew a 7.44 rating, destroying the finish of Page vs. Flair on WCW, which did a 3.00 overrun. But that was also going 2 minutes past the finish of Raw, so realistically, with viewers turning over, that figure over the head-to-head period may not have been more than 2.5. In the final quarter hour, Raw with the evening gown tease and the setup for Rock vs. Austin did a 6.71, while Nitro with the beginning of Flair vs. Page did a 2.95. Raw should top a 7.0 this coming week, with Nitro preempted for the NBA playoffs. Thunder will also be preempted this week. In its infinite wisdom, WCW during Nitro never acknowledged not being on the air next week. There are a few points that need to be made besides the obvious one about Raw delivering what the audience is looking for. The worst thing about these ratings are the intangibles. Raw is in. Nitro is out. Wrestling fans have grown to hate Nitro and WCW for all the reasons written about here every week, and WCW is doing everything every week to only make the problems worse. Nothing short of a total overhaul is the answer. There were problems a few months back that led to some of this, but the freefall the company is taking is largely based on some of the worst booking ever over the past 3 months. One can make excuses that are valid, that it's going to take months of rebuilding before this can be turned around. But what has been happened of late, with the exception of one excellent show a few weeks back, is not rebuilding at all but simply digging the hole deeper by emphasizing all the things that have made the gap this wide. WCW had nothing as far as ratings were concerned going for it except Goldberg and Flair for the past 2 months, and now, due to Goldberg becoming just another guy after not being protected as he needed to be, and Flair being a heel and while remaining the most entertaining person in the company, he's playing a role the audience doesn't want him to play. Now both are almost as dead as everyone else as ratings draws. Bringing back Piper and Savage in prominent roles was exactly what a company painted with an image as being out of date and ancient didn't need. The argument that Kidman and Benoit and the likes would get killed in the ratings if made the main focal point of the show and put high on house show cards is true for right now. But at this point, at least they are young and can be built. And who were The Rock, the Road Dogg, Val Venus, Shane McMahon and the Brood 1 year ago? WCW is going to get killed for a long time no matter what it delivers. The Monday Night War and Wrestling War as far as being competitive has been over for weeks, and it's garbage time in the fourth quarter of a game where the team behind has mentally quit and the score gap continues to grow. It's time to rebuild, but instead, WCW builds around 40-year-olds. A title reign for Page. A title reign for Nash. Savage looking for the fountain of youth. Retreading Piper. Flair reverting back to the 80s. Hogan coming back as a top face. Sting and Luger in the spotlight continuing to fail when put in a high position. Like Scott Hall is going to make the slightest bit of difference. The money, thought, and television time spent on people like Hall, Savage and Piper should have been spent on Jericho, who instead looks to be leaving, and at this point he'd be a complete fool not to. And a bunch of younger guys who have been totally devalued in booking as being secondary stars, who also can't draw ratings. An entirely new set of stars and a new concept of television is needed. A new set didn't mean crap. Ricky Rackman, DJ Ran, and putting the announcers to ringside were as effective in the healing process as putting makeup on a cancer wound. There are no answers that are going to lead to winning anytime soon. The only answer at this point is to rebuild like a sports team. Expect a horrible record in 1999. Expect to get killed in the ratings every week. But build around younger talent and get them over as the main players. The older guys need to be used at this point for only one thing, putting over the younger guys. Anything else is basically fooling oneself. A football team that has its entire starting lineup past its prime and is in the middle of a 3-13 season doesn't trade its draft choices in order to sign more people 5 years past their prime. The WWF SmackDown special on the UPN network on April 29 drew a 4.0 rating and 6.4 share. Figures that have to be considered disappointing since it was heavily promoted with a Raw-like show and did numbers that were nothing close to Raw level. The total homes delivered, despite the show reaching more than 90% of the country, was 3,828,000, as opposed to Raw a few days later, which was seen in 4,834,000 homes but available in 76% of the country. Still, the show destroyed another lethargic and uncreative episode of Thunder, which drew the show's second lowest rating in history and lowest ever on a Thursday with a 2.55 rating. The UPN network is set to finalize its fall schedule on May 20th. At this point, there is no deal with the WWF for a 1-hour show, but UPN, based on the ratings, would like a weekly show on Tuesday nights from 9 to 10 p.m. but would like WWF to sell the advertising and pay for the costs, so it would be treated as different than normal prime-time programming. If no deal is reached by May 20th, another show would be put in that time slot, so negotiations between the two sides are on something of a strong deadline. UPN had averaged a 3.7 rating in the time slot SmackDown was put in during the past month, so it was only a slight increase over normal programming. The show placed fifth in its slot behind NBC, which drew half hours of 13.9 for Friends, 12.1 for Will and Grace, 15.1 for Frasier and 12.3 for Veronica's Closet, CBS, 7.2 first hour, 7.0 seconds hour, ABC, 4.7 first hour, 4.7 seconds hour, and Fox with the aborted Robbie Knievel jump doing a 7.6 first hour and with Wildest Police Chases doing an 8.4 seconds hour. The WWF was far stronger in the major markets than the smaller markets, doing a phenomenal 9.2 in New York, losing only to NBC, a 5.8 in Los Angeles, behind NBC and Fox a 6.1 in Chicago, fourth, beating ABC, a 3.7 in San Francisco, fourth, a 4.9 in Boston, fourth, a 7.5 in Detroit, third, a 3.4 in Minneapolis, a 3.5 in Denver, a 3.9 in Portland, a 2.3 in Baltimore and a 3.5 in Dallas. Other WWF ratings numbers for the week saw Livewire at 1.7, Superstars at 2.1 and Heat at 3.95. WCW Saturday Night on May 1st drew a 1.9 rating. In last week's story on the life of Rick Rude, there was one more very important story regarding his initial departure from WCW that was more than just simply the back injury from the match at the Fukuoka Dome. Before the Japan match, there were numerous problems brewing between Rude and WCW to the point that many were very skeptical at the time, due to the timing of it, as to the legitimacy of Rude's back injury. In the weeks leading up to the match, Rude had asked WCW to buy him out of his contract, which paid $315,000 per year, similar as they had done when dumping several contracts at around the same period of time, paying guys a figure of about 60% or 70% of what was left on their contract to simply go home, and in exchange the wrestler wouldn't work for opposition groups. So Rude, who had been bothered by neck and back injuries already, was attempting to negotiate his way out of the company and into either a retirement or a lengthy hiatus, literally days before suffering the career-ending back injury in Japan. In addition, to attempt to pressure WCW to acquiesce to his wishes, he also stated that he wouldn't put Ric Flair, Vader or Hulk Hogan, who was to start with the company 6 weeks later, who along with Sting were the biggest stars in the company at the time, over for various different reasons. In the days when wrestling big show main events were actually planned out months in advance, the plan at that time was for Hogan to debut on July 17, 1994 at Bash at the Beach in Daytona Beach, Florida, and either do a tag team match with Flair, a babyface at the time, teaming with him against Rude and Curt Hennig, who WCW was attempting to lure out of retirement at the time, or if Hennig fell through, as it did, do Hogan and Sting versus Flair, who would turn heel to start a program with Sting and Hogan teaming with Rude. In both scenarios, Rude was the one who was going to drop the fall to Hogan, and Rude still had heat with Hogan from the WWF days because Rude, due to the size difference, never got a big money program with Hogan even though he was a better heel than the majority of those Hogan worked with during that period. With Rude out of the picture, the plans were changed with Flair unifying both titles by beating Sting and using Sherry Martel as his manager, turning heel once again in the process, leading to them going right to Flair Hogan in Daytona Beach and Hogan winning the title in his first match with the company. WCW at the same time was unhappy with the quality of Rude's matches because his work had declined largely due to his injuries. Nevertheless, even with the two sides at a major contract dispute, WCW went on with its plans as usual, as silly as it sounds now, and it sounded just as silly at the time, and had Rude, despite him threatening to leave and not do jobs, go over for the WCW International title over Sting in the Fukuoka Dome match. In the weeks before a May 22nd pay-per-view match where Rude, having won the title, but having missed all his scheduled WCW house shows after that point due to the injury, it wasn't clear if Rude would come to Philadelphia for that show. As it turned out, this was the only pay-per-view show Rude ever was scheduled to main event in WCW on his own. He also was part of a War Games main event, which drew a disastrous 3,600 paying $53,000 to the Civic Center and in 0.48 buy rate in a match where he was scheduled to defend against Vader while Flair would defend the NWA title against Barry Windham. Originally, that was set to be a double countout finish which would lead to a Rude vs. Sting return 1 month later. The feeling was going into that match that there were three possibilities. At the time, Rude wouldn't show up in Philadelphia, and they would announce the Fukuoka Dome result had been reversed and Sting was still champion since Rude came off the top ropes, illegal at the time under WCW rules, although it was in New Japan where it was legal, or because of outside interference of Lady Love, which isn't exactly what happened but was the closest to what happened. Rude would show up for a final match and drop the title in the ring to Vader, or everything would get worked out and Rude and Vader would do the double count out with Rude retaining the title. At least 1 week before the show, it was clear that Rude wasn't going to be able to wrestle on the show. However, that didn't keep WCW from still advertising the match as the pay-per-view main event. As it turned out, Rude showed up in Philadelphia saying he wanted to fulfill his contractual obligations, and while not being able to wrestle, or as it turned out, even appearing on the show, was actually the biggest story on the show. Rude was supposed to do something where he'd do an angle or wind up giving the title up and Sting would face Vader for the title on the show. Rude refused to do it and it got seriously heated between Rude and Flair, the booker at the time, before Rude walked out of the building just before the live show started. This left poor Nick Bockwinkel, serving as WCW's commissioner, to be the fool in front of the cameras. Before the first match, Bockwinkel came out and announced that the International Board of Directors had nullified the title change in Japan because Rude used the title belt as a weapon and because he came off the top rope with a knee drop for the finish, and that Rude wasn't going to be wrestling on the show. Fans booed and chanted rip-off when it was announced Sting would get the belt back, even though Sting was the face. Sting then refused to accept the belt unless he could win it in the ring against Vader, which only slightly quelled the audience. Rude sued WCW for the remaining $630,000, settled out of court when Eric Bischoff signed Rude to his 3-year contract in November 1997 on his contract and collected Lloyd's of London disability. The WWF did a tremendous tribute video to Rude, with comments from both Vince McMahon and Terry Taylor, on the May 2nd Superstar show. There have been numerous reports stemming from the WCW hotline, which is often the place to get the least reliable information on WCW, which we've been unable to confirm, that WCW would continue to pay the family of Rude for the remaining 2 years on his contract. For whatever this is worth, the company didn't do the same for Louis Spicolli, although he didn't have a wife and 3 young children. WWF paid Brian Pillman's family on his contract for 3 more months after his death, and also cooperated in numerous fundraising activities for the family, including allowing talent to participate in memorial shows last year and this year. A correction from last week regarding GHB and ecstasy. They are 2 different drugs. GHB is more popular with a lot of the older wrestlers, and ecstasy, which comes in pill form, is the big nightclub drug and more popular with the younger crowd. Kazushi Sakuraba, a product of Nobuhiko Takada's dojo and a former pro wrestler with both the UWFI and Kingdom Promotions, scored the biggest shoot win of his career, a majority decision victory over Vitor Belfort, the man who at one time was considered to be the future of the UFC, as the biggest story coming out of the Pride 5 show on April 29 at Nagoya Rainbow Hall. The show was a mix of legitimate fights with an exhibition, Hickson vs. Royler Gracie, and with a work main event purported to be a shoot under rules very similar to UFC, with promoters Dream Stage Entertainment changing several rules, including adding judges' decisions in the event matches went the time limit. The show was originally billed with a double headliner, with Nobuhiko Takada doing a worked shoot with former UFC champion Mark Coleman, which Takada won with a heel hook in 1:45 of the second round in a match which got over more to the live crowd than any other, and people were praising Coleman in what would be his first ever major league level performance of something approximating pro wrestling, which Coleman is training for, with Shudo heavyweight champion Enson Inoue facing Mark Kerr, generally considered the top heavyweight fighter in the world of MMA. Kerr, who is training for a career in pro wrestling and is being seriously looked at by the WWF, suffered an elbow injury that required surgery and had to postpone the match until probably the next show on July 4th at Yokohama Arena. That show will also have closer to a pro wrestling match headline, the show with Takada most likely facing NWA champion Naoya Ogawa, stemming from an angle done at this show. There may be a hold-up with that match, which should draw a much better crowd than this show for a number of reasons, the main one being a more marketable main event, and that is the finish would at this stage of the game have to go in Ogawa's favor, and Takada may not be so willing to give up his position. While martial arts purists hated the idea of a worked match, particularly one involving Coleman, as the main event on the biggest shoot show of the year, and no matter how you slice it, it is to a degree a fraud. The match itself was said to have gotten over the biggest to the live crowd. And they are missing the big point about sports as business and compromises that have to be made because of it. Without Takada as a drawing card, there is no promotion. And without worked matches, there is no Takada. Clearly, even with Takada, it's going to be a tough go for survival since Takada's abilities and lack thereof were somewhat exposed in his 2 matches with Rickson Gracie, which is why they needed to buy him a win at the cost of a $60,000 payoff to Coleman to try and revitalize his name at the age of 37. The show only drew a crowd announced as 7,565 to 13,000-seat Rainbow Hall, and that figure was significantly inflated and the actual paid attendance was about 4,000. Nagoya has never been a strong city for pro wrestling with the exception of New Japan, which has traditionally sold out the majority of its shows since the beginning of time. Even when the second UWF, at the peak of work shooting, was on fire in Japan and selling out every show, a match with Takada vs Akira Maeda failed to come close to selling out the Aichi Gym. The major difference between Pride and UFC is that Pride has different time limits and no stand-ups, plus competitors are allowed to lay on their back in a defensive posture without being ordered to stand up, as is not allowed in UFC. Ironically, that was the story of the Sakuraba-Belfort match. There were some standing exchanges in the 20 minutes match spread over 2 rounds, which would have on paper appeared to benefit Belfort, the Brazilian phenom with a remarkable hand speed, punching power and punching accuracy. Most of the match consisted of Belfort, unable to deal with leg kicks standing, laying on his back voluntarily and not getting up. There was no ground fighting whatsoever according to the reports we received, which was where Sakuraba, a really good submission fighter who captured probably the weirdest UFC heavyweight tournament in history in Japan in late 1997, figured to have the edge. While Belfort was on his back, Sakuraba continually kicked at his legs, leaving them badly discolored, and he captured what was said to have been an easy decision, putting a real sting on the reputation of Belfort. In the end, 2 judges voted for Sakuraba, with the third calling the match a draw. Belfort and Coleman were the fighters Semaphore Entertainment Group was grooming as their 2 top stars in 1997, just as UFC began being taken off cable systems, with the idea of building to the ultimate dream match between them. But it never got to that level. Coleman was upset by Maurice Smith, and hasn't won a match since, although the decision in his most recent match with Pedro Rizzo was controversial. Belfort, who began his career with a series of rapid-fire knockout wins over 6'8", 300-pound John Hess, Lions Den fighter Trey Telligman, 330-pound Scott Ferrozzo, and a 51 seconds destruction of UFC poster boy Tank Abbott, all before his 21st birthday. He seemed to be unbeatable and well on his way to winning every Fighter of the Year award until showing up at a gassed-up 225 pounds, having been trained by Curtis Leffler for bodybuilding, who himself passed away months later at the age of 31, and running into Randy Couture, who was booked for him with the idea of being a heavily credentialed wrestler who, because of how they stylistically matched up, would pose little danger to Belfort on his way to a big money match with Coleman and/or Kerr. Of course, it ended up with him being humbled with a shocking knockout loss. After a lackluster performance and a win over hand-picked Joe Charles, Belfort blamed the Couture loss and Charles' win over a period where he was weakened by a parasite, and seemingly regained much of his lost reputation when he trimmed to 199 and destroyed highly rated Wanderlei Silva in 44 seconds on October 18, and was seemingly headed for the biggest match of the year in 1999 against Frank Shamrock. Those who know Belfort best marvel at his ability and question his mentality. He several times pulled out of the match with Silva, who he destroyed, and had to be constantly talked into doing the show since so much of the promotion was built around him. It was the same problem in Japan, where he wasn't 100% and turned down any tough opponent before hand-picking Charles in what was a suspicious-looking match. He was scheduled to main event the most recent UFC against Guy Mesger, but pulled out, citing a knee injury. Back in late 1996, Belfort was scheduled to make his UFC debut against Ken Shamrock and also pulled out of that fight citing a knee problem. And after arthroscopic knee surgery a few weeks back, there was some question whether he'd face Sakuraba or not. In the pro wrestling aspect of the show, Ogawa, who for a brief period was scheduled to replace Kerr against Inoue, and then was scheduled to do an exhibition with Kazunari Murakami, neither were ever announced publicly, showed up with the NWA title belt and said he's appear at the July 4th show challenging anyone. Antonio Inoki was not at this show, but UFO officials spoke with Rickson Gracie, who was at the show doing exhibition drills with Brother Royler, about possibly doing business, but balked when Gracie's asking price was $1 million. After Takada's win over Coleman, Ogawa came back into the ring with the NWA title belt, took off his shirt and challenged Takada in a pro wrestling style angle. A lot of Shoot fans were upset with them doing a pro wrestling angle after basically a pro wrestling match to headline the show, but again, this got over better with the live crowd than the actual Shoot matches. In the other results, Enson Inoue destroyed Soichi Nishida in 25 seconds with a choke. Nishida, a 310-pound karate champion, was the late replacement for Kerr after Pride failed to get quite a number of named fighters, including Frank Shamrock and Mario Sperry, for fill the spot due to short notice. Igor Vachenchin, the Soviet boxer with the most incredible win-loss record, something like 26-1, of any heavyweight in the world, won a 10 minutes decision over Akira Shoji in a match that was fought all standing. Francisco Bueno of Brazil knocked out Satoshi Honma in about 5 minutes with a right to the face, and the ref stopped it. In the opener, Egan Inoue knocked out Takada protege Minoru Toyonaga, who has also fought before in Pride, Rings and Pancrase, in the first round. Kerr was at the show and shook hands with Inoue after his win. Gary Goodridge, who was in Japan for a match in K1 a few days earlier, was also at the show. In what could prove down the line to be an interesting story involving this company and the United States, Sonny Wanu of WCW went to this show to attempt to work out a deal where future Pride events would air on pay-per-view in the United States on a one-day delay. While the idea of shoot fights involving mostly fighters unknown in the United States wouldn't draw on pay-per-view unless WCW did a phenomenal job in promoting the show, and they can't even do that for their own product, if this was a WCW project, one would think it would be cleared by the major cable companies, including Time Warner and TCI. Since the Pride rules are now almost identical to UFC, it would make the cable ban on UFC that much more hypocritical. Of course, logic, in that argument, like in most arguments, rarely gets in the way of ignorant emotion, and if Pride could get on with complete clearance, is no guarantee any American promotion promoting basically the same product would. Lawrence Burtman, better known in wrestling as Larry Burton, was the big loser in a week-long series of lawsuits that went to jury in an Akron, Ohio court regarding the dying days of the old United States Wrestling Association promotion. A series of 4 lawsuits and countersuits wound up combined into one case in federal court regarding the purchase of the USWA by XL Sports Incorporated from Burtman and Jerry Lawler in 1997 and the subsequent bankruptcy of the company. XL Sports Incorporated was suing Burtman and Lawler on RICO Act federal racketeering for, among other things, fraud when it came to the sale of the company. Mark and Eugene Selker, who headed XL Sports Incorporated, who a personal fraud lawsuit against Burtman and Lawler. Burtman filed a countersuit charging RICO Act racketeering and fraud against the Selkers. And finally, Lawler failed a suit against Burtman for money owed regarding the sale of the company. A jury of 5 women and 3 men awarded XL Sports Incorporated $3.5 million in a judgment against Burtman and $0 in a judgment against Lawler. Lawler was also awarded $1 million in a judgment against Burtman in a decision that came in on May 3, which was the reason Jim Ross made the remarks twice on Raw later that evening where he called Lawler the Teflon King. In a nutshell, the very complicated scenario saw Burtman, using the name Larry Burton, make a contact with Lawler and eventually broker a series of sales of the USWA, which at the time was not doing well financially. Lawler and Jerry Jarrett co-owned the company, and Jarrett, who handled the business end of the company, was considering folding it in 1996 because business was doing poorly. Burtman set up a contact with Mark and Eugene Selker of Cleveland, who formed a limited partnership called XL Sports Incorporated with the idea that Burtman and XL Sports Incorporated would buy the company and try and exploit revenue potential largely from television syndication, advertising, and merchandise, something Lawler and Jarrett had never done since the wrestling business they knew was promoting shows and selling wrestling tickets and using television as a way to sell wrestling tickets. Lawler and Burtman apparently kept Selker apart from Jarrett to the point that XL Sports Incorporated, when buying the company, not only had never seen any company books, which Jarrett had, but didn't even know there was a Jarrett and thought Lawler was the owner. Both Burtman and the Selkers planned to buy 100% stock in the company from Lawler for $2 million and keep Lawler employed for a 6-figure price as the top wrestling star. Lawler then bought Jarrett's 50% interest in the company for $250,000 and turned it over to the Selkers, who paid approximately $1.1 million for the stock. Burtman was scheduled to pay Lawler $1 million for the remaining 50% on January 1, 1998, or if he defaulted on the payment, Lawler would get his stock in the company back. After just a few months of Burtman and the Mark Selker running the company, they became suspicious, and with good reason, of each other and the company, which was losing money at a rapid rate, declared bankruptcy. During the 5-day lawsuit, the Selkers alleged a steady stream of fraudulent schemes, largely by Burtman, apparently hoping to tie Lawler into it as Burtman's partner. The significance of Lawler is that he was really the only person in jeopardy, as Burtman has a huge judgment against him now, but no assets, so even though XL Sports was able to prove in court that they had been defrauded in the sale, they will likely not be able to gain anything from the fraudulent transfer. Had XL Sports Incorporated lost its lawsuit against Burtman, they have no assets, either having declared bankruptcy. Lawler, as expected due to his verbal skills and poise under pressure, was a difficult witness for XL Sports, was able to completely separate himself from Bertman in the jury's eyes. The judge was only going to allow 5 days for all 4 cases to be heard. Vince McMahon was scheduled to testify as an expert witness for Lawler, the only witness he was going to call, on the potential value of the USWA when it came to syndication revenue, merchandise revenue, and worth to the WWF as a farm system to develop talent. However, the judge refused to allow the trial to go into a second week, and McMahon, who was in California getting ready for the Raw show, was unable to fly back to Ohio until after the San Diego taping. During the trial, the judge several times urged Lawler, as being the only person with anything at stake, to settle before it went to the jury, and there were a number bandied about back and forth, but the two sides were never close. Jerry Jarrett was a key witness for the Selkers in portraying Bertman as a con man, and his comments about Lawler was that he wasn't a good businessman, which is why he handled that aspect of the company, but was the greatest actor/performer he'd ever seen at making the people believe what he said, comparing him favorably with the likes of Hulk Hogan, Steve Austin, and Randy Savage. Juventud Guerrera and Anibal Eduardo Gonzalez, and Jerry Flynn, William Brenneman, were both arrested at 2 a.m. on April 29 in State College, Pennsylvania the night before Nitro and drunken driving charges. Guerrera was arrested at gunpoint and charged with a DUI, fleeing police, reckless driving, and running several stop signs, and released on $10,000 unsecured bail. Flynn was charged with a DUI and released on $5,000 unsecured bail. Flynn wrestled the next night in State College while Guerrera wasn't used on the show, but worked the WCW weekend tour. Both were tested at 0.2 blood alcohol content, more than double the legal limit. Japanese television rundown. April 18, Pancrase. This was the live pay-per-view show and was the company's best show in a long time and its best Japanese pay-per-view ever. They did a better pay-per-view show for the United States in 1996 with the legendary Masahitsu Funaki vs. Boss Ruden match, which is still easily the best show in company history. 1. Katsumi Inagaki beat Daisuke Watanabe in 7:44 with a choke. This was mostly grappling and pretty even until Inagaki caught Watanabe. An ordinary Pancrase-style match. 2. Daisuke Ishii drew Dayu Takase in 15 minutes of a Valley Tudo Rules match. Takase, who weighed only 176 for this match, is best known for beating Emmanuel Yarbrough, who weighed in at around 680 for that fight, in a Valley Tudo match last year, which is still the only fight I've ever seen where one guy kicked the other guy's ass by running away from him for 10 minutes until he was totally exhausted and practically collapsed. Most of the early portion saw Ishii on top, caught in Takase's guard. Takase took some blows to the ear and was bleeding from it. They stopped the fight and checked the ear, and there was some debate about allowing him to continue, but they did. Takase actually tried to surprise Ishii with a dropkick, which didn't do much good. He tried a Thez press as well. That doesn't work in real life either. Toward the end, Takase laid on his back, stalling for the time limit, and refused to stand up. Both guys were given red cards because Ishii wouldn't attack him either. Takase took him down and got a side mount, but Ishii got up. With 30 seconds left, Takase flopped on his back again to stall out the time. Ishii would have none of it this time and dove on him and got about 10 seconds of good punches in. Had there been judges, Ishii would have won. Some of it was okay to good, but there was a lot of stalling as well. 3. Asami Shibuya drew Chris Lytle in 15 minutes of a Valley Tudo Rules match. Shibuya had a 13-pound weight edge and was by far the superior fighter. I believe Lytle is from Indiana and was trained by Gary Myers. Shibuya was in Lytle's guard early and appeared to let Lytle reverse him to sucker him into a knee bar. Somehow Lytle escaped, and the position his knee was in looked horrible for a split second before he got out. Shibuya was back on top in the guard and threw a sick headbutt. 5 minutes. The crowd was kind of shocked with the brutality of that one. Shibuya went for a heel hold but didn't get it. Lytle did a good job in avoiding being finished and even got on top and threw some punches and headbutts before Shibuya reversed him with 15 seconds left and went for another submission as time expired. Shibuya looked good, but he was bigger and had much more experience and couldn't finish, but would have easily won the decision. Not too bad. 4. Kengo Watanabe drew Bob Steins in 15 minutes. Steins was 6'5", 255 and appeared to be a big American who didn't know much on the ground to be brought in to make Watanabe look good. Facially he looked just like Steve Blackman, although he had no physique at all. Steins took Watanabe down and was caught in his guard right away, and aside from throwing 3 headbutts, did nothing from the top but try and hold his position. It wasn't until 9:30 when Watanabe escaped, so that part of the fight was really boring. Watanabe then took Steins down and was in his guard, but at least was aggressive as hell, throwing a lot of head and body punches along with headbutts, and got more aggressive as time ran down. Even though Steins was on top longer, Watanabe made the most of his time and clearly would have won the fight had there been judges. Even though it was basically a guy caught in the guard for the last 5:30, that portion because Watanabe threw so much was good. But 3 15-minutes time limit draws in a row got old. 5. Leon Dake upset Evan Tanner in 12:39 via KO. Tanner took Dake down immediately and started throwing open hands to his head. He got him into his side headlock, which is his winning submission, and Dake escaped. Fans popped for that. Tanner continued to dominate him on the ground until Dake escaped a triangle at 8 minutes and got to his feet. The two had a really hot exchange of kicks and knees. Dake, a kickboxer who has trained with Boss Rutan, was the better striker and got more blows in, but Tanner got the best blow, a knee to the nose, and it was like Dake's nose exploded with blood flowing thick and took him back down. The ref stopped the fight to check Dake's nose, and it was stopped for several minutes as the ref and doctor discussed it with Dake, who wanted to continue. Finally they agreed to allow Dake to continue. Tanner took him down again, but Dake escaped and they started trading on their feet. Dake threw a kick to the stomach followed by 2 open-handed palm blows to Tanner's face, and Tanner was stunned and turned his head like he instinctively wanted out more than he was knocked out. He was given a 10 count and didn't get up. Very good match. 6. Yoshiki Takahashi beat Omar Buish in 9:28. It was Takahashi's first match back, as he's done this too long and has suffered too many injuries. Takahashi was showboating early, working the crowd almost like a pro wrestler. He was originally a shoot-worked style pro wrestler in the old Fujiwara promotion before being one of the pioneers of pancrase, and while goofing off caught a kick in the mouth which woke him up to reality. He immediately took Buish down. Buish knew a little on the ground. At one point Takahashi turned him into a pro wrestling half Boston Crab. The crowd loved seeing the pro wrestling move in the middle of a real match. Buish rolled out of it. When he did the spot, even the announcers talked about how Takahashi was a good entertainer. Finally Takahashi got the armbar for the win. Good match. 7. Masakatsu Funaki drew Ebenezer Fontes Braga in a Vale Tudo rules match in 15 minutes. This was a really good match. Braga clearly won the fight, but it was more competitive than most of the early reports indicated, although Braga was on top almost the entire way. Braga took Funaki down at 110 and was very aggressive with punches and headbutts. Even though Funaki held him in his guard, since Braga is 6'2" and Funaki is probably 5'10", his arms were long enough to connect with a lot of solid hard punches to the face even in the guard, but Funaki did show a lot of mental toughness, never flinching, quitting or panicking while eating some heavy leather. Funaki was very patient, getting hit in the face, and waited to make his move for a leg lock at 5 minutes, but was countered. Funaki wound up on top, but they rolled to the ropes and Braga reversed back and connected with more punches. Funaki was cut above the right eye at 8:45. Braga continued to hit a lot of hard punches to the face. While in the guard, Braga did combinations of elbowing Funaki's thigh, trying to break the guard, and as he tensed his high to hold guard, Braga would hit him hard in the face. Braga broke guard and tried to stand up. Funaki wouldn't get up, so Braga tried a flying stomp to the head and got back on top. At the 13 minutes mark, Funaki, from the bottom, started unloading with headbutts and punches, and Braga retaliated. Funaki delivered some very effective blows from the bottom, probably as effective as I've ever seen in this style of fighting from the bottom. But that left him open, and Braga countered with punches that were even more effective because of the better leverage of punching down instead of up. The match finished with a good slugfest. 8. Yuki Kondo won the vacant King of Pancrase title. Guy Mesger was the champ but vacated it, deciding to fight in UFC, beating Semishield in 20 minutes. We had incorrectly reported this as a 15 minutes match in the April 26th Observer. This was not a great spectator fight, but it was an excellent insiders match because Kondo was awesome working the ground and it never slowed down, even though it was mainly grappling on the mat. Kondo, giving away probably 14 inches in height and 53 pounds, kept 90% of the match on the ground, as there was absolutely no way he could have survived due to the incredible reach and height had they stood up. Kondo took him down immediately and kept going for forearm chokes. He put on a grappling clinic due to his conditioning, as he kept moving and looking for openings, and Schultz was able to counter his attempts very well. Since Kondo was continually maneuvering, they didn't order a stand-up until 7:20. Schultz started connecting with his reach, but Kondo took him down with a belly-to-belly suplex and went right again with a forearm choke. The groundwork was awesome here. Schultz managed to get to his feet at 11 minutes and started connecting with his deadly knees, but Kondo took him down with another single leg and again tried to a forearm choke. Kondo got a full mount. He held a side mount most of the fight. at 13:30 but couldn't do much with it and a stand-up was ordered quickly. Schultz blocked the takedown and hit a knee and threw some hard kicks to the face before Kondo timed another kick and took him down again and went for an armbar, but Schultz escaped. Kondo continually looked for openings from the side, got the full mount again, but again couldn't do anything and a stand-up was ordered at 18:56. Kondo went for a takedown but Schultz sprawled and threw a killer kick right to the face when Kondo was down at 19:17 for a red card. Kondo was knocked silly from the kick. Since it was an illegal move, Kondo had the match won and he was out. For whatever reason, he insisted on continuing the last 43 seconds. Both the doctor and ref examined him for several minutes but he wanted to go back out there, which showed a lot of guts since he'd won, but was kind of dangerous, not to mention kind of sick, letting him go back out since he'd been knocked out. The match actually stopped for 5:30 before they'd let Kondo go back out, and when they restarted, Kondo took Schultz down one more time and was working for a submission when time expired. Kondo fought an excellent technical fight. April 18th, All Japan. 1. Vader pinned Kenta Kobashi to win the Champion Carnival in 1911. Another excellent match. Vader got an armbar early and threw very believable-looking punches to the face. Kobashi hit his lariat out of nowhere early, got a near fall that popped the crowd big. Vader delivered 2 body splashes and a third splash off the middle rope for a near fall. Kobashi came back with a dropkick to the knee, a dragon screw, an ankle lock and knee bar submissions with rope breaks, and then a half crab. Vader took control with a body block off the apron. It picked up at the 15 minutes mark when Vader came off the top and got caught in the power slam, the same spot he did in every match during his peak years in WCW. Kobashi got a good near fall with a German suplex. Kobashi hit a moonsault for another near fall. Kobashi hit a lariat to the back of the head and was coming for a second lariat when Vader sidestepped him and delivered this killer German suplex, and the crowd popped pretty good when Kobashi kicked out. Vader did a moonsault for a near fall. Crowd was going nuts at this point. Vader hit a hard power bomb for another near fall before connecting with a tackle and a lariat for the pin. Both men hugged after the match, which was a big deal because by All Japan standards, the two had a major feud in January. They also showed Vader backstage crying after the match. Anyway, I guess the Comeback Player of the Year award is pretty much a lock this year. 4 stars. The rest of the show was clips from Baba's funeral the next day. They played Baba's ring entrance music on the organ as Motoko Baba came out, followed by Lord Blears, the Destroyer, wearing the mask, Stan Hansen and the rest of the wrestlers. On television they showed Seiji Sakaguchi, New Japan, Shinya Kojika, Big Japan, and Tarzan Goto at the funeral, and showed Sakaguchi shaking hands with all the All Japan wrestlers, and he did an interview on the show. Consider the American equivalent of all that taking place and you'll realize the magnitude of what that was. It was amazing seeing just how many people came, 28,000, and it seemed like a huge percentage of them at least had flowers. By the time the ceremony was over, no exaggeration, there had to be 5,000 bouquets of flowers inside the All Japan wrestling ring or surrounding it, and when it was over, Motoko came out and threw the last bouquet of flowers. Mexico. Very slow week when it comes to news. There is a big show on May 9th in Naucalpan at El Toreo de Cuatro Caminos, which was the biggest outdoor arena for wrestling in the late 70s and early 80s. There will be a 16-team trios tournament involving trying to bring together legendary teams from the glory days of wrestling in the building. Teams announced are El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas and Dandy, Los Hermanos Dinamita, Los Machos, El Signo and Salomon Grundy and Mano Negra SR. They wanted to reform the old The Death Missionaries but couldn't get either El Texano or Negro Navarro, Headhunters and Love Machine Jr., Dr. Wagner Jr. at El Hijo del Gladiador and Grand Marcus Jr. reforming the White Wave, Solar Uno and Dos and Mascara Magica, Fishman and Villano Tercero and Babeface, Valentin Mayo and Lobo Rubio and Shu El Guerrero. They wanted the return of Los Temerarios but Joseph Luis Feliciano and Black Terry didn't make it. Tony Arce and Vulcano and Rocco Valente reforming Los Destructors, the original 3 Brazos back together, Oro Jr. and Plata and Blackman Jr. Los Vikingos, Los Diabolicos back together, Zumbito and Black Warrior in El Hijo del Diablo, Filoso and Astro Rey Jr. and Aguila Solitaria as Los Seitas del Ring and Shocker and Olympico and Tony Rivera. Reports a few weeks back that Lizmark Sr.'s career was over due to heart problems were premature as he was back in the ring wrestling over the weekend in Tijuana. There may be some legal problems regarding Felino's jump from CMLL to AAA. Paco Alonso apparently has ownership rights to both the name and Felino costume. CMLL ran its big show of the week on Tuesday instead of Friday, with the April 27th show having Ringo Mendoza retain the CMLL middleweight title, beating Blue Panther, and America Rocca winning a hair versus hair over Kid Guzman. The April 30th show was the 56th anniversary of pro wrestling at Arena Coliseo, with the first show being on April 26, 1953, headlined by El Santo and Medico Asesino beating Rolando Vera and Blue Demon. The May 4th Arena Coliseo show will have a ceremony to honor the third anniversary of the death of longtime ring announcer Vitorino. The return to Arena Mexico has been moved back to May 21st. Tijuana on April 30th had a one-night tag team tournament with the losers advancing. The final saw Kiss and Solar beat Phobia and Super Astro, which sets up the two losers meeting in a singles match on May 7th, in a mask versus mask match, so Phobia is probably dropping his mask this week. Phobia is actually the younger brother of Psicosis. Honky Tonk Man will be making his Mexico debut, teaming with Doink the Clown, Matt Osborne, and Pirata Morgan against Los Brazos in the Come On event. On April 30th in Querétaro, they had Los Vados Locos versus Los Payasos in a cage, with the last man left losing their hair or ask. As it turned out, all the Vados Locos got out, leaving both the red and yellow-haired Payaso. They had to fight, and the red-haired guy vamoosed out of there. The Payaso unmasked as Vicente Carbajal, who was formerly known in UWA as El Indomito. IWRG had another Japan vs. Mexico High Power Cup on May 2nd in Naucalpan, which they have quarterly at the arena now. Don't know the teams, but do know that Japan won, with Shima Nobunaga pinning El Suicida, which sets up a singles match between the two on May 9th in the same building. All Japan. A correction from a few weeks back on the attendance for the April 16th Budokan Hall Champion Carnival Finals. While it was announced as a sellout, the actual crowd was closer to 13,400, which isn't a very good sign for the future. New Japan. It appears that Shinya Hashimoto will finally return in June. The biggest show of the week was May 3rd at the Fukuoka International Center Arena before a sellout 7,500 fans, with Keiji Muto retaining the IWGP Heavyweight title, pinning Genichiro Tenryu in 25-37 after a moonsault in the main event. Tenryu, 48, delivered a Frankensteiner during this match for the first time in his career. After the match, apparently trying to set up an interpromotional match that would do huge business, Muto challenged to Misawa and Kawada. Kensuke Sasaki and Shiro Koshinaka retained the IWGP Tag Team titles, beating Kazuo Yamazaki and Yuji Nagata in 16:38 when Sasaki pinned Yamazaki after a clothesline. The other title match on the show saw Koji Kanemoto retain the IWGP Junior title, beating Tatsuhito Takaiwa in 11:36 with a Boston Crab submission. That was the final show of the current tour, with New Japan starting back up May 19th with the Best of the Super Juniors tournament. Other Japan notes. Masato Tanaka and Tetsuhiro Kuroda won FMW's vacant World Brass Knucks Tag title in the final of a many-week tournament on May 3rd in Nagoya, beating Hayabusa and Koto Fuyuki in 24:54 when Tanaka pinned Fuyuki with a rolling elbow. Tanaka and Kuroda on the same show, in order to get to the final match, had to also beat Geto and Koji Nakagawa. Although this wouldn't be big news in the US for a number of reasons, since arrests of wrestlers aren't that rare, and because wrestling still doesn't get the daily mainstream coverage, the arrest of War's Kazumasa Nihei on April 23rd after a show in Kawasaki received front page of the sports section press. Apparently another wrestler, Masao Orihara, had gotten his girlfriend, and Nihei, 33, went nuts and went after him with a knife and was arrested by police. Nihei started as a manager in 1995 and became a wrestler a year later. The OB promotion, which generally does interpromotional shows in memory of Rikidozen about once per year, announced a change in promotional makeup but not a next big show. Junzo Hasegawa was the chairman of the board and Shohei Baba was a main advisor. Michiaki Yoshimura was named the new chairman and Shinya Kojigawa was named vice chairman along with Kotetsu Yamamoto, and they announced Takichi Endo, Rikidozen's sometime tag team partner in the 50s, Antonio Inoki and Seiji Sakaguchi as the remainder of the committee. Their big show this year will be a tribute show to Junzo Hasegawa, who ran the old JWA promotion during the late 60s and early 70s. Ultimo Dragon announced that his Toryuman group would be joining with Buko Dojo, headed by Takashi Okamura, the group of wrestlers that were the stable of retired Koji Kiao, and open up a training gym in Kobe. The idea would be that aspiring wrestlers would go to Buko Dojo, and the ones with the most potential would be sent to Japan to be trained by Dragon. On the April 22nd Korakuen Hall show, Dragon came to the ring in his ring outfit and slapped his top four protégés, Sumo Fuji, Judo Suwa, Magnum Tokyo, and Shima Nobunaga. Dragon's next tour of Japan will be July 4th to July 16th, with the biggest shows on July 4th in Hakata Star Lanes, July 6th in Nagasaki, July 11th in Kobe, and July 16th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. They are doing a big angle on May 16th at Korakuen Hall for Gia, with Chigusa Nagio vs. Asia Kong as the main event. The gimmick is something to the effect of that if Kong, being sent to Lioness Asuka, wins, that either Gia must fold or Nagio must leave the company. The next UFO show will be June 29th at Osaka Furitsu Gym. Rings cancelled its June 19th show in Nagoya and moved it to June 24th at Korakuen Hall. Rings drew a poor house the last time they were in Nagoya, and with the May 22nd show scheduled for Tokyo Ariake Coliseum, they need to load that show up to draw as well. Winger Takashi Okano won the Big Japan Junior title, beating Fantastique on April 29th in Shizuoka. Mike Samples showed up for Big Japan on April 30th in Suwa, attacking Tomoaki Honma. He'll start as a regular on June 13th. Promoter Kojika said that Samples reminded him of 50s and 60s star Bill Miller. Somehow I think he's the only person in the world who would say that. Super Delphins Osaka Pro Wrestling ran its debut show on April 29th in Osaka, drawing a crowd announced as 1,861 for a main event, with Delphin and Naohiro Hoshikawa and Masato Yakashiji over Dick Togo and Black Buffalo, Rafi El Salsero from IWRG, and Violencia. Byers from CMLL also is appearing on this tour. Tiger Mask made the first defense of his British Commonwealth Junior Heavyweight title, beating Ikuto Hidaka on the Michinoku Pro card on April 29th in Niigata. Kendo from Mexico and Sho Funaki are both on this tour. Urshin held a one-night tournament on May 4th at Korakuen Hall, with Michiko Omukai beating Hiromi Yagi in the finals. Queen of Urshin champion Mariko Yoshida will be going to Mexico to defend her title on May 15th. Besides the return of Sho Funaki, the current Michinoku Pro Tour includes Fallen Angel, Christopher Daniels, Pablo Marquez, and Toryuman wrestlers Yasushi Kanda, Kenichiro Arai, and Magnum Tokyo. Here and there. Got a chance to see some of the press out of the Oregonian regarding Senate Bill 238 in Oregon, which would exempt touring pro wrestlers from drug testing. There was an article by columnist Dan Horch, who really didn't understand pro wrestling even though he watched an evening of Raw and Nitro and described the action. Somehow reading someone who isn't a wrestling fan describing Raw sounds a lot more vulgar than watching the show, because we all are so desensitized by seeing it every week. Horch's main point is that nude dancing does exist in Oregon and there is sexism and other forms of exploitation on television, but that Oregon has no obligation to change its state laws because promoters consider the current law too onerous. The Oregon Arena Corporation, which runs the Rose Garden in Portland, is sponsoring the bill, claiming that the law requiring drug testing of wrestlers keeps wrestling fans from being able to attend live events, and the building and city are missing the economic activity live shows would create. Wrestlers would still have to submit a letter from a doctor saying they are physically able to perform, but not have to undergo a physical in Oregon nor have to be drug tested. Loren Glover, new director of the commission, said that the drug screenings may start including steroid testing, which would guarantee the promotions don't come to town. Both sides have pretty strong arguments on the subject. Glover's argument is the state would be sending a bad messages to kids by dropping laws on drug testing in an industry rampant with drug use because big companies can abide by the state law. The wrestling companies argue that they are entertainment, not sport, thus shouldn't be regulated, noting participants in other forms of entertainment aren't drug tested. Although nobody wants to address the reality of what pro wrestling is, the real versus phony issue and sport versus entertainment issue isn't necessarily the germane argument. For example, as mentioned last week, boxing is real and wrestling isn't by that definition. But if both activities have a lot of bloodletting and there really is an HIV risk from exchanging blood in open cuts, which after so many years of an AIDS epidemic and no cases of this happening in boxing or wrestling, I consider the original fears from 10 years ago overblown. Just because wrestling cuts are often self-imposed doesn't make the exchange of blood any less dangerous. Just because there are no winners and losers as far as sports competition being changed by usage of drugs, doesn't make the drug usage to get ahead in the industry any less dangerous to the participants and the sport. But it isn't as if any state regulates, including Oregon regulates bodybuilding shows or even beauty pageants where drug usage is a big factor in changing outcomes. When Jim Byrne of the WWF was contacted by the Oregonian, he claimed that the drug tests could cost up to $1,000 per wrestler and that the typical show has 70 performers and sometimes as many as 120, trying to give the impression it would cost the WWF $70,000 to $120,000 just to comply with the law. Of course, those figures are so far beyond ludicrous as getting a physical and a drug test in Oregon runs to about $200, and the WWF, just as an example, had 30 wrestlers work the TV taping on April 26 in Hartford and 32 work the house show 2 nights earlier in Madison Square Garden. They would also have to license referees and seconds so the real figure could top 40, and with all the run-in guys at a taping maybe a few more. But the idea of 120 performers on a show is beyond belief. Senator Gary George, who sponsored the bill, said that the fact that other performers aren't drug tested says that pro wrestlers shouldn't be either, claiming the current practice is discriminatory. The article said the bill would have enough support to get out of committee provided the state police, who are against the law change, can first reach a compromise on the wording with the law change as proposed by the arena. The state police have been reluctant to bend on drug testing of wrestlers, but have been willing to negotiate on language that would deter drug use but make it easier for WWF and WCW to come to Oregon. If drug testing scares them off, I guess people can draw their own conclusions from that, said Police Captain Bob Miller, who oversees boxing and wrestling for the police department. Dwight Janes, a sports columnist who has far more familiarity with pro wrestling than any other reporter on the paper, wrote a column saying that pro wrestling should be totally deregulated. His argument is that the government doesn't regulate drug testing for the NBA, so why should it for something that isn't a sport? Janes said the fact wrestling is a scummy business isn't a good enough reason, because there are plenty of scummy business, noting strip clubs which employ hundreds of women, in the state, so why be concerned over the health of a few wrestlers? Janes said he deplores people allowing young children to watch pro wrestling, but he considers the current law de facto censorship and finds it insulting. He says pro wrestling is fine as adult entertainment and adults should have the right to make decisions about what they want to attend. Mike Rogers, the Northwest's leading wrestling historian, wrote in Ring Around the Northwest, "There are the people who shake their head and point at Oregon for being ridiculous in the fact they do drug testing. There has got to be some irony somewhere, as I looked at a recent website that had the top story of Rick Rude passing away from a heart attack, and the next article wants to do away with drug testing in Oregon. You know, maybe if every state had drug testing for the past 12 years like Oregon has, maybe Louis Spicolli, Brian Pillman, Rick Rude, and a number of others would still be alive." In the latest independent wrestling follies, New Dimension wrestling promoter Chris Plano was involved with shows in conjunction with a minor league baseball game in Binghamton, New York on May 1st and the Philadelphia Phillies vs. Los Angeles Dodgers pregame wrestling match on May 2nd at the Vet Stadium. Manny Fernandez was coming up for the Binghamton show and took a detour in Washington, D.C. and instead worked an NWA show. Plano had to scramble and get local wrestlers at the last minute to have a show. Plano then failed to deliver the ring for the Rock and Roll Express vs. Head Shrinkers match at the Vet, so the four simply brawled all over the baseball field and into the stands, including Samu giving Ricky Morton a piledriver on the top of the dugout, which reports say made it a more entertaining show anyway. Rock and Roll Express won, so the Phillies mascot, the Fanatic, who refereed, got 5 minutes with Jimmy the Geek, who played heel manager, and both the Fanatic and the mascot mother of the Fanatic gave him big splashes. Marty Jannetty was injured in a hit-and-run accident and will be out of action for a few weeks. In an item that has received a few wire service stories throughout Canada, a group of indie wrestlers out of St. John's, Newfoundland have formed the Cutting Edge Wrestling Party and are planning on having wrestlers run as candidates for offices throughout the province in the next federal election. Adam Peddle, 20, who wrestles for Cutting Edge Wrestling as their version of Jason the Terrible, a sales clerk in real life, is doing the publicity stunt for his company that runs matches in local bars. Pierre Martel, who at one time worked for the WWF as manager Frenchie Martin, has returned to wrestling for the AWA group based in Puerto Rico, feuding with Barrabas Sr., who is so old he was the original trainer for Carlos Colon. Victor Quiñones IWA is running a June 25th Big Show at Hiram Bithorn Stadium in San Juan with Big Show vs. Undertaker, Road Dogg vs. Billy Gunn, Miguel Perez vs. Bob Holly, Val Venus vs. Draws, Huracan Castillo vs. Midian, and Taka Michinoku vs. Jeff Jarrett. In the WWC, the big angle is that Colon is out with legit knee surgery. Colon has been limping in the ring for a few years and limited to mainly working very short matches, and at 53, with the knee problems getting more serious in recent months, finally decided to get it fixed. They did an angle on April 24th in Fajardo to explain the surgery, very similar to the Hogan deal, as Ray Gonzalez used the Bret Hart figure 4 around the ring post on him after a match. With Colon out of action, they're bringing in Abdullah the Butcher to headline the house shows against Gonzalez for the Universal title. La Tigresa, real name Soldalina Vargas Ortiz, made her surprise return over the weekend after a 2-year absence. In February 1998, she and her boyfriend were arrested on charges of smuggling cocaine and heroin into prisons. Mark and Chris Youngblood and Jim Steele, All Japan's Wolf Hockfield, are headed in this coming weekend. The Youngbloods will be challenging Victor the Bodyguard and Chicky Star for the WWC Tag titles. Music City ran the biggest show in its history on May 1st in Nashville, drawing 900 fans, paying $10,300, the biggest gate for a show at the Nashville Fairgrounds in 10 years, headlined by Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee versus the Fabulous Ones. The match went 24-53, ending when Stacy jumped on the apron, said "hit my music," and did a total Rick Rude knockoff, stripping down to black lace bra and panties. Apparently Dundee grabbed one of her shoes and went to hit Stan Lane, who ducked, and instead hit Lawler, who was pinned, although apparently nobody in the building actually saw the finish because everyone was staring at Stacy, who apparently has the requisite new body. Everyone was raving about the heat generated at the show by a tag team called the New South, Corey Williams and Ashley Hudson, an African-American and Australian who dress up in Confederate flags. The semifinal with Colorado Kid vs. Stevie Richards never took place with no announcement in the building as to why. Although a lot of different stories have gone around, Richards actually worked an NWA show that night in New Jersey. Richards was under the impression he was going to do the job since Kid holds the North American title, and since Music City airs on Channel 48 in Philadelphia, some fans in his hometown would see it, and so, being that he's the NWA 2000 champion, which he hadn't won when he agreed to the date, and didn't want to be on television doing a job since it would theoretically hurt the local indie group, as silly as that sounds today, he decided after discussing things with other wrestlers the night before to skip the show, although apparently he never told the promotion, as Burt Prentice went to the airport to pick him up and he wasn't there. I think things have been worked out and they are going to try and turn it into an angle and have the match take place at a future date. Kid also ended up missing the show since Richards wasn't there and he wasn't 100% from having his wisdom teeth pulled. This group's next major show will be June 5th as the second annual Tojo Yamamoto Memorial Show. Naoya Ogawa will be in the U.S. from May 21st to June 6th and make several title defenses. The tentative schedule at this point is May 21st in Pittsburgh, possible opponent Semu, May 22nd somewhere near Charlotte, possible opponent Craig Pittman, May 28th in North Richland Hills, Texas, probable opponent Kit Carson, May 29th in New England, Eric Spraxia or Knuckles Nelson most likely opponent, June 2nd in Conyers, Georgia, Gary Steele of the United Kingdom most likely opponent. BBC is doing a documentary on Steele coming to the U.S. working indies, and this is being filmed as his big match, June 4th in Pine Hill, New Jersey and June 5th in Middletown, New Jersey, with one of the dates against Doug Gilbert and the other possibly against Don Fry. There also may be a Tampa date, which if it goes through, would likely be against Dan Severn. Kazunari Murakami, who has exactly zero pro wrestling experience that would translate into the U.S., he's done work-shoot style matches on UFO shows which are entirely different, is coming on the tour as well and will work at some of these shows. The NWA tag title situation will finally be rectified and in the ring as Nelson and Spraxia are scheduled to go to Texas against Team Extreme on June 10th. There are two major lucha-style cards scheduled for May 15th at the International Amphitheater in Chicago and May 16th at the Bronco Bowl in Dallas. Both shows are headlined by Pero Oguayo and Mil Mascaras and Tinieblas, at a combined age of nearly 300 versus Nikozuna, Sam Fatu, and Blue Panther and Jerry Estrada, El Eo del Santo and Tinieblas Jr. and Mascara Sagrada versus Fuerza Guerrera and Rey Mysterio Sr. and Warlock Plus Minis, including Mini Rey Mysterio Jr. who is also Zuki and Max Mini in WWF, and locals Adrian Lynch and Danny Dominion versus Adam Pearce and Rockin' Randy. In Memphis on May 1st, they are turning Randy Hales back into the babyface promoter, seemingly copying WWF in that regard. Now all the wrestlers are complaining babies and Hales is the guy who has to deal with them. The TV show opened and Bulldog Reigns was mad about being booked and said he wouldn't leave until Hales came out. Reigns was mad about Hales not returning his calls during the week and Hales said his brother-in-law had a heart attack. Kid Wicked then came out and started complaining that PPW was an old man's company and they needed to start pushing the younger guys. Steve Bradley came out and complained that he deserved more airtime. Mike Tierney came out and said he should be the showcase star of the company and that Wicked, who was about 5 feet tall, was a smurf. Reigns was Humpty Dumpty and that Bradley was a cartoon character. Kurt Angle then came out and said everyone else had been given a shot to be the main star and he didn't, and that he was a true shooter and Tierney wasn't. Glenn Kulka came out and said he could take anyone in the promotion. Derek King came out and said he was the best entertainer in the company and that's what the fans want today. Vic Grimes came out and said he's like Mankind and he's hardcore and that's what fans want today. Bill Dundee came out and said all of them combined couldn't draw 15 cents at the gate and said Cactus Jack was nothing but the first fat man to break a table, and everyone started fighting everyone. The May 7th show in New Daisy Theater has a 16-man Royal Rumble with the winner getting a shot at PPW champ Michael Hayes later in the show. Dundee vs. Carl Ouellet, Tierney vs. Angle and Grimes vs. Fatu as the top matches. Reigns beat Young Guns champ Steve Bradley in a non-title match on TV due to help from Wicked. Terry Funk vs. Sabu will headline the June 6th show in St. Catharines, ONT at the Canadian Auto Workers Hall for Apocalypse Wrestling. In what may be his final career match, Bad News Allen, 55, crippled by knee problems, faces the Jackal in the main event of a Tony Condello show on May 10th in Regina, Saskatchewan. Stampede Wrestling is running May 20th in Edmonton and May 21st in Calgary with Tatanka vs. Jim Neidhart as the main event. Al Snow and Val Venus will be appearing for an RF video autograph session at Wrestling Merchandise Store at the Neshaminy Mall in Philadelphia on May 15th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Blaine DeSantis has shows in the Reading, Pennsylvania area on May 14th and May 15th, bringing in indie workers from around the continent. May 14th as Venom Black Tijuana vs. Oro Jr., who now works as El Suicida in Naucalpan, a triangle with Reckless Youth, Christopher Daniels and 2 Cold Scorpio, Flash Flanagan vs. Joe E. Legend from Canada and Glenn Osborne vs. Michael Modest. May 15th has Scorpio vs. Lance Diamond, Oro Jr. and Venom vs. Daniels and Youth, Osborne vs. Legend and Modest vs. Flanagan. Greg Bones of the Australian Wrestling Federation at P.O. Box 3382, Parramatta, New South Wales 2148 Australia is looking to hear from talent interested in working in Australia. Send a bio, photos and a working videotape. Former wrestler Sonny Roughhouse Fargo, who formed a headline tag team with brother Jackie Fargo in the 60s and 70s, saw a 3-foot-wide tree crash through the roof of his home in China Grove, North Carolina and nearly kill him. Fargo, real name Jack Fagart, who later worked for Crockett as a referee in the 80s, is now 71 and confined to a wheelchair after an infection forced him to have to amputate one leg in 1991 and the other in 1996. The tree missed him by inches and he was trapped under the debris until a neighbor came to his rescue and picked him up out of his wheelchair. He wasn't seriously injured, suffering only a few scratches. Due to the success of wrestling, Columbia TriStar TV is producing a show called Battle Dome, designed to reach pro wrestling fans, for syndication and has already been cleared in 90% of the country for the fall season. The show, which appears to be based closer to the very successful American Gladiator show which had a strong 8-year run in syndication, will pick a team of 10 male and females who will face challenging amateur teams picked every week from different local TV markets. The show will have high production values and special effects and theatricality, but the competition is said to be real and the results not predetermined. Yokozuna and Tonga Kids Tour of the UK generally hasn't drawn well in England, but they had sellout of around 1,000 for 4 shows in Scotland. Jacques Rougeau is running a second show on May 7th in Montreal with himself and Raymond Rougeau headlining against former Montreal top heels Abdullah the Butcher and Ron Garvin with Michel Dubois, who held the world title in Montreal in the early 70s before going on to a good deal of stardom in the US and Japan as Russian Alexis Smirnov, as referee. MMA. The rundown of the May 7th UFC pay-per-view show from Birmingham is it'll be a 6-match television card. Main is Boss Rutten, 1-0 versus Kevin Randleman, 7-2, to finally crown a UFC heavyweight champion. Also Pete Williams, 4-1 versus Travis Fulton, 57-13-5, which is a legit documented record and also shows fighting that often over a few-year period that he must be half out of his mind. And Trey Telligman, 9-1-1, versus Pedro Rizzo, 8-0, with both Williams and Rizzo in line for possible title shots. Rizzo, should he win, based on previous wins, should be the next in line, but if Rutten wins the title, he and Rizzo won't face each other. In a lightweight match, Laverne Clark, 5-2, faces Fabiano Iha, 8-0, in what is on paper the most intriguing fight of the show since Clark is strong in both boxing, which he does professionally for a living, and has a 13-4-1 record as a pro, including a recent knockout of the 1992 Olympic bronze medal winner, and 62-6 record as an amateur, and wrestling where in high school he placed second in the state twice, and since his state is Iowa, that's a big credential. Iha is mainly a submission fighter. A middleweight match has Silva, 9-2, against Tony Patara, 6-0-2, and the added match, replacing the Sean McCulley vs. Chris Brennan match cancelled due to a contract dispute and an injury respectively, will be Chris Kondo, a 300-pound fighter in his first MMA match from Memphis, facing Ron Waterman, a 260-pound fighter out of Greeley, Colorado, 3-0, who was a college wrestler years ago and recently won his weight class in the Boss Rutan Invitational in February. From a marquee standpoint, it's a weak show. The style mixes are interesting and could create either exciting or boring matches the way they match up. Randleman will clearly take Rutan down early, and it's a question of Rutan can hook him on the ground or stun him standing later in the fight. Randleman has fantastic stamina for someone of his physique. Teligman vs. Rizzo matches two guys who are strong stand-up fighters with kickboxing skills, and both know their ground games as well, in a Lion's Den product and Marco Ruiz top student respectively. Theoretically, Silva should blow out Patara, but you never know, and Silva is fighting again just 10 days after a fight in Brazil. Even if it was a 40 seconds fight, all the preparation and the flying from Brazil is still a stress. Besides the Pride show, there was another major MMA show on April 28 in Brazil which drew a sellout 8,100 fans, I believe, in Sao Paulo, which was described as perhaps the most brutal MMA show in history. For the night there were a total of 3 broken hands, 1 set of broken ribs, and 2 guys having teeth knocked out, plus a total of 200 stitches before the night was out, and fans at ringside literally could smell the quantity of blood combined with the heat from the mat to give an eerie iron-like smell. The main event saw Carlos Barreto defeat the Pedro in 4:20 on a tap from punches from the mount in what was reported to us as a worked match. Pedro is best known in pro wrestling circles for beating Koji Kiao in a legit shoot, losing to Keiji Muto on a major New Japan show in a work, and losing to Mark Kerr in a disputed ref stoppage in a shoot. Pedro was a last-minute replacement for Travis Fulton, who failed to get his visa. The best match on the show was a 30-minute war between Pele and Jalda Oliveira, which Pele won via decision. Wanderlei Silva, who is scheduled on the May 7th UFC pay-per-view, came out of the show unharmed with a 40 seconds knockout win over Eugene Jackson. Apparently Maurice Smith not only will face Peter Aerts in the main event of the next K1 show in Sapporo on June 6, but also face Andy Hoke in a big match later this year, which could be on the annual K1 Monster Show in Switzerland. From what I've seen of the April 25th K1 show from Yokohama, it looks like it was an awesome show. The other matches announced for June 6 were Kirkwood Walker defending the Wako Muay Thai heavyweight title against Musashi, and Masaki Sadake vs. Jim Mullen. Randy Couture captured the 1999 U.S. Greco-Roman Championships in a tournament held over the weekend at 214 pounds. Tom Erickson placed second in the super heavyweight class in freestyle to current NCAA champion Steve Neal of Bakersfield, losing 9-3 in the finals. Erickson is undefeated in MMA and has a match scheduled against an opponent as yet unannounced on the May 22 ring show at the Ariake Coliseum. Frank Trigg, who has fought in Shooto this past year, placed 5th in freestyle at 167. Shooto will be running its 10th year anniversary show on May 29 at Yokohama Bunka Gym. Carlos Newton will be the biggest name foreigner on a show headlined by Rumina Sato vs. Kaoru Uno. The next USWA show on May 22 in Amarillo, Texas at the Fairgrounds will feature Paul Jones defending his light heavyweight title against Larry Parker, Ali Elias defending the middleweight title against Shannon Rich, and a tournament to crown a lightweight champion. USWF ran May 1 in Dumas, Texas, with Brent Meldy winning a lightweight tournament. May 23 Pancrase in Nagoya has Kiyuma Kunyoku vs. Keiichiro Yamamiya for the number 2 ranking, Jason DeLucia vs. Ryushi Yanagisawa for the number 4 ranking, plus Leon Dake vs. Manabu Yamada, Asami Shibuya vs. Huiza Minowa, Daisuke Ishii vs. Takafumi Ito, and Kosei Kubota vs. Daisuke Watanabe. A new promotion called Samurai Challenge is scheduled to start on either July 11 or July 12 in Japan, which will apparently include both K1-style kickboxing matches and MMA-style matches. There will be a kickboxing pay-per-view show on May 14 in the U.S. headlined by 80 star Don the Dragon Wilson, who for years was the UFC color commentator. ECW. There appear to be problems this week involving Shane Douglas, Axel Rotten, Chris Condito, and Tammy Sitch. Douglas, who is out with the ankle injury, wasn't brought to the Florida shows. Traditionally they bring injured stars to all the shows for them to do run-ins or anything, due to problems between Douglas and Paul Heyman. Heyman firing Douglas' best friend in the company, who ran the merchandise stands, was another divisive issue between the two. It includes Douglas being owed significant amounts of money, his body breaking down from injuries, and Heyman wanting to phase him out of the title picture in favor of younger guys. Rotten no-showed the first night and wasn't brought in after that point. Condito and Sitch were at all the shows but weren't used until the final night of the tour. There were problems stemming from Condito throwing a temper tantrum backstage at the show in Queens. Sabu also missed the weekend shows, but that was due to a family emergency where he flew to Japan, His wife is Japanese. Taz also wasn't there because his wife was expected to give birth at any moment. It now appears Little Guido vs. Yoshihiro Tajiri will be added to the May 16th pay-per-view show. The Dudleys vs. Rotten and Balls Mahoney match for the tag title on pay-per-view is in jeopardy because the status of Rotten isn't definite. Weekend house shows saw April 29th in Palmetto, Florida draw 800, April 30th in Fort Lauderdale drew a sellout 2,000 for the television taping, May 1st in Cocoa Beach drew 1,100 and May 2nd in Kissimmee drew a sellout 1,300. With Douglas out, Jerry Lynn was moved into the feud teaming with Dreamer against Justin Credible and Lance Storm. There are apparently people who are claiming that the reason ECW didn't get on WSBK in Boston is because the station got too many calls and emails about wanting the show on. Think about that one for a second. A TV station gets too much response to wanting a show on, so for that reason they are tired of hearing from fans and won't air the show? Anyone who believes that is as dumb as the people who believe ESPN ran that special on wrestling because it was an ABC plot to hurt wrestling because it hurt Monday Night Football ratings last season. This past weekend's TV taped in Queens featured Lynn beating Taka Michinoku in a 3.5-star match. The Condito and Steve Corino angle with Taz aired. It was heavily edited from the original form and it was a decent angle on television, although apparently nearly 15 minutes was edited out. Nova beat Guido in a good match. When they exchange blows standing they need a lot of work, but their high spots are really good and they did a ton of near falls. Nova won with a Kryptonite Crunch, which is similar to a Goria Special Bomb. Dreamer beat Storm in about 7 minutes with a Spicoli driver on a table. I don't know why WWF and WCW haven't come strong after Storm and he's got it. He looked very good carrying this match. One thing about watching ECW television as opposed to pay-per-view shows and why matches are so much better on TV. First, the TV matches are usually in the 7 to 10 minute range. These guys all work hard and can do crazy spots, but in a 15-minute match, if you don't have psychology, the crowd heat won't sustain. They'd be better off doing 7 minutes pay-per-view matches instead of trying to do 20 minutes matches, and almost always the guys are out there too long, not only for the psychology problems but also because fans simply have short attention spans and can be very impatient. After the match they put a cinder block on Dreamer's groin and broke the block with a chair. Dreamer was selling it huge, but the crowd, which doesn't believe any injuries, seemed not to take it seriously. WCW. The Charlotte Nitro on May 3rd was kind of the epitome of everything that's wrong with the company. Nitro, which used to be a first-day sellout, now in Ric Flair's home city, they had to have Elliot Murnick go around town and hand out free tickets to have an acceptable-sized crowd for television in the big Coliseum. They drew 9,705 fans in a building that was set up for 18,000, but only 6,379 were paid for $187,275. The entire Carolina/Virginia region has been killed by WCW because the fans always leave unhappy since the promotion has apparently had people writing the shows, and we know who they are, that always took great delight in sticking it to the Flair fans in his home region, and they figured it out and stopped coming. But this show was about doing everything possible wrong for the company. The show opened with Arn Anderson breaking Flair out of the mental hospital with all the mental patients. Scott Hall was the bus driver, although nobody actually saw that. They had the new look Ricky Rackman interview a NASCAR driver. You know that putting Rackman on weekly is going to lead to far more lenient sentences for perpetrators of homicides. Mysterio Jr. and Kidman beat Steve and Scott Armstrong in 4:06 when Mysterio Jr. jumped off Kidman into a Hurricane Rana off the top on Steve for the pin. Real good heat. The work was a step off but the finish was spectacular. Benoit and Malenko attacked Mysterio Jr. and Kidman and the Horsemen were actually booed in Charlotte for it, which shows just how not seriously everyone takes them as being horsemen. Raven and Saturn made the save but then they laid out Mysterio Jr. and Kidman. Finally Benoit and Malenko came back in and destroyed Raven and Saturn with their finishers. Bagwell beat Ernest Miller in 8:43 with the blockbuster. Really bad. About half the match was stalling, and the other half was missed moves. Miller was missing everything, particularly his kicks, all over the place. After the match Miller chased Sonny Wanu to the back as Wanu had kicked him in the face before the finish. Whose idea was it to book this match for that length of time? Flair showed up with the mental patients and this roided-up girl from his gym. Flair was nearly the first casualty of the ramp. He called out Savage and Gorgeous George, Page and Sting and Goldberg. Flair fired Savage. He was going nuts. He started to strip. They went to a commercial. This was a total mess of a segment because the crowd wanted to cheer Flair, but he was so uncool and they aren't about to boo him, so this pretty much killed the entire show. Savage came out with his entourage of Medusa, Miss Madness, woman wrestler Starla Saxton, who is actually the one training Gorgeous George, and George. The fans booed the hell out of Savage. Flair told Savage he was fired and told security to get rid of him. Savage and Medusa were beating the hell out of security before they were dragged off and arrested, although Savage, without the other two, returned later in the show, and Flair told George to stay. Flair practically molested George, who was wearing a top way too small. The difference between WWF and WCW is that WWF has women with giant implants in tops way too small and hope for that moment where they have an accident and a breast pops out. And darn, we screwed up the replay and got a better shot of it. In WCW, if the same thing happens, they switch camera shots to where you can't see it. George started beating up on Sir Charles, and then the buffed-up nurse, who looked like Nicole Bay's smaller and prettier sister, tore up George without doing much of anything and left her dead without her top covering what it was supposed to, and Gene Okerlund put his coat over her as they dragged her out. Flair called out Sting, who punched Flair. Fans were hating this by now. He called out Goldberg, who punched him. Then for no reason Goldberg and Sting went at it and the fans were booing the pull-apart brawl. The brawl was good for about 45 seconds. Flair then offered Stevie Ray $100,000 to take out Nash. Hawk no contest Bigelow in 1347 when they killed each other in a horrible garbage match with no heat, when then Brian Knobbs did a run-in and beat on both with a garbage can and both were knocked out. This was a worst match of the year candidate coming on the heels of that great brawl they had on the pay-per-view. Ray told the Black and White that Flair offered him $50,000 to take Nash out, and if they worked together, he'd split it with all of them evenly. I don't think there's a sport with less team ethics than pro wrestling. Triple A from the mental hospital was hiding in the bathroom when Ray swerved his buddies, and then he came out and told Nash that Flair offered Ray $1 million to take him out, but then said he didn't believe Flair would ever do such a thing. Conan beat Horace Hogan via DQ in 8-10 when the Black and White interfered. Nash made the save. Conan said if they did a run-in he had a surprise as he made a deal with someone backstage. Nash came in. Then Conan acted totally stunned that Nash saved him. Nash acted like he had no idea how Conan would react to him. I wasn't wondering about how another angle didn't make sense, I was just wondering why Nash let those two guys wrestle for 8 minutes in a competitive situation. Ric Flair brought in David Flair and Torrie Wilson. Rick forgave David for putting him in the nut house and said he was going to book him in a match and have Charles ref it, so he basically only had to show up to get the win. Wilson looked like she was revolted by Rick. Guess she didn't grow up a wrestling fan either. After they left, Rick booked David against Meng. Piper showed up and was mad because Flair made a comment about making love to his wife, and he said that went too far. They went too far when they resigned Piper to begin with. Piper came in the back and beat up Flair while the Nut House guys tried to save Flair by hitting Piper with a beach ball. Thankfully Piper didn't sell it. Flair ended up drenched and mad, so he told Scott Steiner to kill Nash. Why Nash? Scott was running around looking for Nash, but instead found Buff and beat the testosterone out of him. They were doing a satellite hookup for Luger and Liz to make an announcement, but the satellite went down, which is of course what was planned. I guess they want to reintroduce those two, which is exactly what the company needs at this point, is for them to dominate TV time. Meng destroyed David with the death grip in 324. It was bad, as David is so hesitant in there and even in Charlotte nobody cared about him. David went out on a stretcher while Rick, unconcerned that his son was dead, was trying to pick up on Torrie. She may be the best looking woman in wrestling, but she was wearing far too many clothes to get over to WWF wrestling fans. They showed another George workout video. 2.9 quarter. DDP did an interview and compared himself to Elway, Gretzky, and Jordan, except that they all retired while he's in his prime. And they're all 10 years younger than he is. Booker T no contest Hennig in 228 when Ray interfered for no reason and Rick Steiner made the save. A police officer gave the order to round up the mental patients because they didn't have releases. Somebody should have told him they can't do that. Who will book Nitro? Finally, Flair came out after all this mess in Charlotte, the city of his matches with Steamboat and Vader and Wahoo and everyone else, to almost no crowd reaction. He and Page were out there for 1320 struggling to get heat as nobody cared about either of them. Savage came out and threw an object to Page and he hit Flair with it and pinned him. Scott Dickinson ran in to count the pin after Robinson was taken out. The crowd was throwing things even before the finish and threw a lot more afterwards. Remember in the old days when business was down in a city, they tried to come up with ways to up the house next time. In WCW, they booked the show almost with the very idea of making sure none of these fans would ever want to come back. In regard to Harry Fujiwara, Mr. Fuji, and his lawsuit against the makers of WCW versus the World Video Games because of their Master Fuji character, I'm told the game is an Americanized version of Virtual Pro Wrestling, a Japanese game, and all the fictitious characters are actually real Japanese wrestlers. Master Fuji is based on Yoshiaki Fujiwara, not Harry Fujiwara, who, if you've ever watched both wrestle, had no similarities whatsoever inside the ring. Hugh Morris won't be getting a knee operation and should be back soon. Conan suffered a stinger taking the stuffed piledriver on the April 26 Nitro show and was told to take a week off, but was back at the weekend house shows. Bischoff called Bret Hart trying to get him back on television as soon as possible. At this point it appears to be late June or early July. Kathy Lee Gifford on Regis and Kathy Lee this past week talked about the death of Rude. Frank Gifford absolutely hated Rude as a shoot because he wore airbrush trunks with Kathy Lee on his crotch on the show and was chasing her around the studio. Frank in his book ripped big time on Rude. Speaking of that, both Jay Andronacco with WWF and Alan Sharp with WCW have made it clear to TV news people that want interviews with people in their companies that no interviews are allowed to ask any questions about either drugs in wrestling or deaths of wrestlers. I guess that makes it clear about addressing those subjects head up and trying to correct things. At the April 28 house show in Pittsburgh, the advertised top matches were DDP vs. Scott Steiner, T vs. Hall and Sting vs. Hart. Of course Hart, Hall and Scott, bad back which is looking like it'll need surgery at some point and doesn't work house shows, weren't there. It ended up with T vs. Hennig and DDP vs. Rick Steiner, where they did a title-saving Dusty finish DQ to end the show. Fans expected Sting against someone as there was never an announcement made about Sting not being there, but Sting, when asked to replace Hogan at Nassau and Philadelphia, said he'd do it but only if he got Pittsburgh off. The aforementioned matches were still in a newspaper ad the day before the show, although some of the radio advertising had changed. Speaking of Hall, he and Dana are already separated. One good thing was Mysterio Jr. and Blitzkrieg did a long match and really had their working shoes on. Goldberg was asked to replace Sting and face Bigelow, but he's so heavily booked by the company doing personal appearances that they didn't press the issue. Due to the Columbine High School tragedy, WCW has dropped the Alex Wright gimmick and will bring him back with a new gimmick. April 29 Thunder from State College, Pennsylvania drew just 4,348 in a 7,600-seat arena paying $130,521. They advertised a Flair vs. Goldberg dark match on this show, but Flair wasn't there. Don't know the story on why other than perhaps now wanting to sell the angle of him being locked up, because on the show for May 6th, he was supposed to wrestle Stevie Ray as the TV main, but wasn't there and instead Benoit and Malenko vs. Texas Hangman became that week's main event. For the live show going head up with a WWF Network special, Hennig beat T via DQ in a TV title match in 12:35 when Ray jumped in the ring and hit Hennig with an object. Booker was mad about his brother costing him the loss. Long sluggish match and they didn't work well together either. Hawk challenged Nash to a hardcore match. Bagwell came out doing a Scott Steiner imitation. It was more annoying than funny and didn't get over, even though Bagwell really ripped on Scott bad, like saying he watches BET trying to come up with things to see. He also said something funny about being on parole. Anyway, I hope the guy has made out his will. Ray pinned Jerry Flynn, fresh off his own DUI, in 3:28 with a slapjack. Terrible, and this match finished off the crowd for the night. Nash pinned Hawk in 7:02 with a power bomb through the table. Hawk killed himself. Nash didn't. Bigelow challenged Page to a title match under hardcore rules. He said they grew up together in Asbury Park. Since Bigelow is 7 years younger than Page, I always figured Page is one of those guys who keeps going back to high school 5 years after he graduated to hang out with the younger kids. Goldberg beat Meng with the jackhammer in 5:31. The fans at least chanted for Goldberg, but the match didn't have much heat. Page did an interview and thanked Jody Hamilton, Dusty Rhodes and Jake Roberts and bragged about being a two-time world champion. Savage beat Disciple in 8 minutes with the elbow. Disciple subbed for Disco Inferno, who was sent home because he was suffering from pink eye. I think he got it in his dreams the night before as I rebelled, as he had this premonition about what a match with Savage and Disciple would look like. Wasn't Disciple fired for not beating Hogan? Finally, Page beat Bigelow when Savage helped him after a ref bump and dropped the elbow on him in 12:10. For the next week was Chavo Jr. over Prince Iaukea, Mysterio Jr. over Chris Kanyon, whose nose was busted open during the match, Raven and Saturn over Scotty Riggs and Mike Enos, Horace Hogan and Brian Adams over disorderly conduct, Rick Steiner beat Eric Watts and Benoit, and Malenko beat Texas Hangman, disorderly conduct under a mask. Fans were furious when this was the last match and the show ended without Flair versus Goldberg. WCW ref Brian Hildebrand was down to 76 pounds this past week, suffering from stomach cancer and unable to keep any food down. He was hospitalized and given a stomach operation and had a catheter tube inserted to feed him through an IV 24 hours a day, and had gained up to 97 pounds just a few days later. Goldberg was on QVC, and when asked about what he's doing in the future, he said that he really doesn't know because they don't tell him anything, and when asked about why Nash saved him and why it's never referred to, he said they often change things by Thursday from Monday. For April 2nd in the UK, Raw had 350,000 viewers to Nitro's 280,000. The Sky Sports station that carries Raw is available in 1 million homes, while TNT Europe that carries Nitro is in 2 million, so it is actually an unfair comparison, in favor of Nitro figuring these head-to-head. Kidman was out until Nitro this week due to a family emergency. Saturn was hospitalized on Monday, I believe due to back problems, but was back in the ring on Thunder. Barry Windham is actually out of action because he's having liposuction done on his gut. WCW is working with a company that is releasing Nitro perfume. A correction from last week. Mike Tenay is not actually on the booking committee. He's sitting in on booking meetings so he can know what's going on to produce openings for the television shows. Super Luchas reported that Villano Quattro is just about ready to return after neck surgery. House shows this week saw April 27th WCW Saturday Night taping in Bismarck, North Dakota drew 5,256 paying $113,184. April 28th in Pittsburgh drew 4,847 paying $90,790. April 30th in Uniondale, New York at Nassau Coliseum drew 9,874 paying $341,035. May 1st in Philadelphia at the Spectrum drew 9,408 paying $266,888, and May 2nd in Norfolk drew 7,287 paying $147,852. In Philadelphia, not one match took place as advertised due to all the problems noted previously. Mysterio Jr. beat Juventud Guerrera with fans chanting DUI at Guerrera. Hennig came out and said WCW has nobody to challenge me, and then Goldberg showed up and beat him very quick. Main was the three-way with Page pinning Flair to keep the title. Sting was third man in a good match. Besides names mentioned, Jericho was also a no-show, ankle sprain. The night before at Nassau was the same basic show. Jericho was at Nassau in Guerrera's corner and interfered throughout before he crashed into Juvie and Mysterio Jr. pinned him. Flair was cheered in New York, but in Philly, he turned on the Flyers immediately and got booed. The Savage vs. Bagwell match at Nassau also didn't take place for reasons that weren't announced. Merchandise for the week was $274,631 or $5.76 per head. WCW wrestler Ray Lloyd, formerly Glacier, did a charity show at his old high school in Brunswick, Georgia, drawing 1,250 fans and raising approximately $30,000 to help pay for surgery as a birthday present for a 10-year-old who was born with a birth-defective arm. Goldberg flew in from an afternoon visit to a children's hospital in Jacksonville to attend. Also appearing at the show included Disco Inferno, Jim Duggan, Canyon, Chris Benoit, Ron Race, Mike Tenay, Nitro Girls AC Jazz and Chai in the current Miss Georgia. August 10th Nitro has been moved from Denver to Colorado Springs because they are holding Nitro on November 29th in Denver at the new Pepsi Arena. Tori Wilson is on the cover of the current Muscle Mag International. The mag also has a column basically sourced from this newsletter talking about the plight of Dynamite Kid living out his life in a wheelchair. The top two matches on the house shows May 14th through the 16th in Des Moines, Omaha and Sioux City are Sting and Mysterio Jr. vs. Flair and Benoit and Malenko vs. Kidman. Hector Garza underwent a second knee surgery because the first one was screwed up. WWF lineup for the May 23rd Over the Edge pay-per-view in Kansas City looks to be Austin vs. Undertaker for the title with Shane as referee, Rock vs. Triple H, X-Pac and Kane vs. Mankind and Big Show for the tag titles, Godfather vs. Blue Blazer, Owen Hart, for IC title, Road Dogg vs. Billy Gunn, Jared and Deborah vs. Venus and Sable and Snow vs. Holly for Hardcore title. Backlash drew an estimated 1.06 buy rate, which translates into about $5.09 million. In comparison, the WCW Spring Stampede show 2 weeks earlier did an 0.60. The big event of the week was the May 2nd television taping in San Diego for a live Heat and a taped Raw, which drew a sellout 10,177, paying $223,593. Heat opened with Outlaws over Henry and Brown in 114 when Henry and Brown ended up fighting with Draws and Prince Albert. Prince Albert refers to the practice of piercing one's genitals, and were counted out. Dog told Billy, who is called Mr. S by some announcers, and Billy Gunn by others, and Jim Ross usually says Mr. S but sometimes Billy Gunn, that he needed to apologize for what he did to X-Pac. He agreed. As if he apologized. They shook hands. Imagine that. An insincere handshake and a lie in the wrestling business. Then he jumped him again. Kane came out but wound up choke-slamming Dog. Michael Cole did a lengthy narration of a video package on the history of the McMahon family and talked about how the WWF has always stood for integrity. That's like saying the North Pole has always stood for a tropical resort. Shamrock and Test beat Acolytes in 120 when Shamrock used the ankle lock on Farouk. After the corporate ministry, have you ever noticed that taking Undertaker and Triple H out, that the corporate ministry could switch places with the NWO Black and White and you'd have the exact same thing? Destroyed Shamrock and Test. Bossman challenged Mankind to a Boiler Room match. Speaking of which, I'm told the Boiler Room match at the pay-per-view was actually taped 2 hours before the start of the show. They brawled for 140 when the corporate ministry all showed up and Shane locked the door. Behind the door was the lamest beating you've ever seen. A bunch of savage killers standing around with their thumbs up their ass while two of them threw a kick to Mankind about every 5 seconds. Big Show ripped the door from the hinges and made the save, but everyone ran off. Big Show is lucky he was not only born large, but given the coolest entrance music in the WWF. He can't help but get over. Big Show challenged Undertaker but all the crew beat him up and Shane called the San Diego police. Holly beat up Snow and hit him with the head. They did one of those WWF finishes where Holly never covered him and his music just played and the match was over. Holly said he'd give back head when he got a title shot. Big Show started busting the windows of a limo and was arrested. Actually, I'm surprised Raw didn't do an even bigger rating with all the marquee stuff on the show. Shane, who is one fantastic heel, came out with the crew. Mankind, Show, Shamrock and Test cleared the ring with 2x4s and said they were forming a union. A union in pro wrestling? They're about to suffer hard times. Billy Gunn beat X-Pac in 4:59 with the famouser after he kicked X-Pac low as he went for the Bronco Buster. Good match. Road Dogg ran in after to a big reaction attacked Mr. Ass. Gunn hit Dogg with a hard chair shot and had both guys left laying together when Kane showed up and he left. Shane did another interview announcing the TV show and challenging Dad to a match. Vince is such a terrible babyface trying to play a cross between John Wayne and Steve Austin. He's just lucky that Shane is so great as a heel. Stephanie and Linda McMahon came out. He told his mom to shut up and Vince was about to hit him. Vince got the women out of there and left. Shane told Vince that he was behind the plot to kidnap Stephanie from the beginning because he knew it would make Vince forget about business and he could take over. Vince hit the ring and got killed and agreed to fight Shane. This was one of the best angles of the year. Patterson and Briscoe beat Rodney and Pete Gas in 124 when the Preppy Boys ran off. Fans popped huge for Patterson and Briscoe as faces. Since Patterson is 61, he probably can't go long, but he's for a 1-minute match just about the best worker in the company at knowing how to work a crowd. And he was literally working with a broomstick. The broomsticks, at least for their part, took one good bump each. In a 4 corners match, Test won over Midian, Viscera and Bossman when Test nearly killed Midian with a Death Valley driver after Bossman hit Midian by accident with the nightstick in 3:38. All the heels beat on Test after and the Union made the save. This was much better than it sounded. They showed Triple H and Undertaker coming from Vince's office with Vince on the ground in pain and Triple H holding his hand like he busted it on his head. Shane got in the ring and cut another promo saying Vince was a chicken. Of course Vince came out hobbling, collapsed on the ramp and got pounded. Shane beat him up in the ring until Vince made a quick comeback, did a low blow, a flip-off, a stunner and a pin in 147. This was just as nauseating seeing the owner steal the top star's gimmick as when Bischoff, when Sting was hot, stole his gimmick by coming down from the ceiling to get himself over for no purpose other than feed his ego. Any indie guy knows doing the stunner is an easy cheap pop. Acolytes beat Mankind in a hardcore handicap match in 5:39. Mankind kept going under the ring but since he didn't know about the match, he couldn't plant weapons so he used things like cotton candy and the Acolytes didn't sell those devastating cotton candy shots. Even this was pretty good as Mankind took a great pounding. He got the claw on Farouk but Bradshaw clotheslined him. The Acolytes stuff power bombed him through 2 chairs for the pin. Triple H beat Shamrock with China as ref in 7:34. Another good match. China kept cutting Shamrock's offense off and helping Triple H. Shamrock went to suplex her for Triple H saved her. She then gave Shamrock a low blow and Triple H delivered a pedigree. That'll teach Shamrock not to sleep with his sister. Speaking of which, is she still in that hotel room or what? Show beat Undertaker via DQ in 2:46 after Taker cracked a gimmicked baseball bat over his head. Next up was supposed to be Deborah vs. Sable in a stripper match, but Sable wasn't there and sent Nicole Bass in an evening gown as he stand-in. Deborah just stripped her dress off. Jarrett KO'd Bass with a guitar. Venus carried Deborah off and they were making out backstage when Jarrett and Venus brawled. Rock vs. Austin went 26 seconds before all the heel lumberjacks jumped them both. Vince and everyone else in the company showed up and they brawled. It wound up with everyone leaving except Rock, Austin, Undertaker and Triple H. Taker and Triple H each threw their opponent off the ramp to the floor and left them laying as the show went off the air. WWF The Music fell to number 52 on the charts this past week with 24,137 sales. Rod Ketter, whose son died in the Columbine shootings, called WWF and asked for them to mention it on television because his son was an Austin fan, which is why they did that opening. After the Backlash pay-per-view, Rock and Foley called up Adam Ketter, the younger brother of Matthew, who passed away, who was watching the pay-per-view at home with many of the school's football team members. A swarm of bees attacked fans as they waited for the doors to open at the San Diego tapings. Cornette did a tremendous job filling in for Lawler on both Raw and SmackDown. He has the ability to get every point that needs to be brought out over to the audience without sounding phony while doing so or being a comedy figure like Lawler, even though he can be funny. The Sable Playboy shooting took place this week and is now being moved up for a September release. The issue with her is the centerfold sold 1 million copies on the newsstand, up from the normal 700,000 the mag usually does. Steve Austin is on Regis and Kathy Lee on May 23rd and will be taping Oprah in June. The Fox Files episode on Sable, which ended up being taken off the show, will now air on May 27th. Sean Stasiak's ring name is Meat. WWF Superstars also did a very honest piece on Paul White and noted he wasn't a very good college basketball player at Wichita State because he couldn't jump. MSNBC is working on a 1-hour profile on Vince McMahon that will air in June. It is expected to largely be a puff piece. Steve Blackman will be returning with vignettes and a makeover as a heel. Many NBC nightly newscasts including WNBC in New York will be doing a feature on pro wrestling to air the night, May 21st, of the Jesse Ventura movie as a tie-in. Only house show of the week was May 1st at the Pond in Anaheim, which drew a sellout 15,147, paying $422,881. For Anaheim and San Diego, the only shows of the week, the merchandise was $175,141 or $6.92 per head. Anaheim was a totally rearranged lineup with a cage match with Rock and Austin over Triple H and Bossman, Godfather over Goldust, Taker over Shamrock casket match, Big Show over Viscera Bodyslam match, X-Pac and Kane over Acolytes, Jarrett and Hart over Outlaws and Brood in a three-way, Godfather over Goldust, etc. Wrestling had 18 of the top 20 sports videos, 15 of which were WWF. WCW's highest was number 4 for Goldberg. This past week, newspapers in both Indianapolis and Nashville ran stories about area schools banning any pro wrestling references. The Nashville paper ran down incidents in several area schools where kids imitated wrestlers and were either suspended or injured doing stunts. Alan Sharp of WCW tried to differentiate his company from WWF's, saying he finds what WWF doing is very irresponsible because they market to kids. An elementary school principal in Greenwood, Indiana, near Indianapolis, said that kids see the violence, sexual innuendos and Satanism on TV and bring it to school. The Indiana Department of Education said they've heard no other bans on wrestling shirts and gestures in the state, and principals in other area schools said there have been few if any problems related to kids imitating what wrestlers do, although other area principals say if kids are wearing inappropriate WWF clothing they are told to turn them inside out, but there is no official ban. The principal said that virtually all the wrestling fans causing trouble at the school were boys, and a 5th grade girl at the school said that most girls find the popularity of wrestling pretty stupid. The readers' pages. Rick Rude. Here we go again with another death of a wrestling performer under suspicious circumstances. One reader mentioned the parallels between musical performers and pro wrestlers, and it's true. Both lifestyles are filled with a lot of travel, partying, drugs, alcohol, groupies, stress, downtime and alone time. I applaud you for your attempts to have the wrestling companies take care of their own. Baby steps are being taken. The WWF let Steve Regal go since they tried to straighten him out, but he couldn't keep himself clean. Here's something that nobody has commented on. WCW cans Davey Boy Smith while he's laying very ill in a hospital. WWF let Regal go, but they were still trying to get him work in ECW. They also sent Giant Paul Silva to Mexico and sent guys to Memphis to get experience, which helps that promotion as well. What does WCW do for its performers? The WWF treats its wrestlers better, although they are no saints either. I doubt WWF would stop Public Enemy or Gillberg from going to WCW if for some reason WCW would want them. I'd like to see Goldberg versus Gillberg. Done right, it could be very funny. If Terry Pac was all gassed up like she was when she was Terry Power in LPWA, she could probably stack up against Nicole Bass. Now she just looks like a really sexy woman and not like a freak. I want Shawn Stasiak's job. Ryan Shamrock has a future as a scream queen based on her screaming while being crucified. How soon before Stephanie McMahon gets a boob job and a makeover? Andy Thurston. Waltham, Massachusetts. The music/wrestling relationship involving early deaths makes for a more accurate comparison due to the pattern of drug abuse in both. Does wrestling attract the imbalance to begin with? And subsequently, the effects, while tragic, shouldn't be surprising? Kevin Donlin. Glen Burnie, Maryland. As a former occasional referee for the World Wrestling Federation in Western Quebec and Eastern Ontario, I had the opportunity to work one of Rick Rude's matches in Cornwall, Ontario, in the early 1990s. He came out, grabbed the mic, and after his usual cry of "cut the music," he began what I'd like to have right now is for all you fat, out-of-shape Cornwall cornholers. The place went nuts. Throughout the match, Rude kept telling me, I didn't mean to say that. In the dressing room he said I meant to say cornball Cornwallers, I didn't mean to insult them like that. The more he thought about it, Rick went to the road agents and said that he wanted to step out of character and either correct himself over the PA. None of the agents thought that was a good idea. I drove back to Montreal with him and a few of the other boys, and all he could talk about all night was the way he had coarsely insulted the ticket-buying blue-collar types in a factory town. He kept saying over and over they just didn't deserve that. Dave Stubbs. Montreal, Quebec. Pillman. I believe that, except for that klutzy Scott Steiner story, the last time I saw Kimberly on television aside from being part of the Nitro Girls was when she and DDP were into the crowd mingling. They were doing their ring entrance, and as Kimberly raised her hand to high-five a fan, another fan grabbed her breast. After that, women seemed to get scarcer on WCW. There were a few divorces, but all of a sudden Nancy, Deborah, Sherry, Kimberly, Medusa, and Jacqueline, all of whom helped bring me back into watching wrestling in the fall of 1997, were gone, and WWF had all the sex. I don't know if that was a key turning point, but WCW did drop its PG-14 or maybe PG-10 version of sex, less offensive than a 50s Hollywood movie, and WWF took it, made it PG-16 and ran off with the ratings. Also, after years of knowing that the old NWA style of wrestling made the big jerks and the WWF look like clowns, which was okay as long as their audience bought the phony punches delivered with the exaggerated foot stomps, and the WWF stars were always bigger than the better NWA wrestlers. The WCW takeover of the number one spot made Vince McMahon do what he does best. Copy and go one step farther. He used the women, and now we've got hoes, show your tits chance. A Playboy star band before long will get a Sharon Stone-like flashing. As for wrestling quality, I only saw a few WWF matches in 1997, Hart vs. Austin or Hart vs. Michaels, that weren't that same old 1975 WWF Allentown TV tapings quality. Acts like LOD, Nation of Domination, and the like were the reasons I quit watching wrestling in 1983. They were so boring. McMahon upgraded his in-ring product, but did so by asking for the impossible. Guys with WWF bodies and the wrestling ability of a great NWA-style wrestler. The answer? Roids. Get a small, great acrobatic athlete, and with enough chemicals, they become an impressive-looking acrobatic wrestler. He never held a gun to Brian Pillman's head, but he did impose what they call in the paper mill where I work, we still have a union, something called a condition of employment. Pillman knew he could be IC champion if he could combine his ability and working a certain way. Pillman, since he played football and had to butt heads with guys naturally much bigger than himself and other guys already blown up on steroids, was already experienced in doping. Is this the fault of the NFL? I don't think so. I believe it's a case of an individual refusing to accept the reality that nature didn't give them the body to compete at the NFL level. If steroids are a tool of the devil, I contend that the NFL is not the devil itself, but rather the standby observer of evil, which may also be a bad thing. If Pillman drugged himself in college to turn his athletic little body into an athletic big body, then he is to blame. The NFL didn't make the bigger and faster rule equals winner. Nature did. A good big man will always beat a little man, everything else being equal, whether it is the NFL, the NBA, or the Olympics. Pro wrestling is different. In wrestling, a pot-bellied guy in his late 40s can pin and be a bigger star than a young stud in his early 20s. A little white guy can pin an enormously muscular black guy. A small Puerto Rican, Mexican, or Japanese man can pin a giant white guy in front of 20,000 of his own people and become a national hero. A Jewish man can set the all-time record for consecutive wins and be made into a world champion in his first year. A Vince McMahon or Eric Bischoff created environment where a star has to look a certain way, the way created by superstar Graham and popularized by Hulk Hogan, is the classic Faust enticement. If you are willing to sell your soul to Satan, you should accept the terms. Pillman sold his soul to Vince McMahon. Vince knows there are X number of people out there who meet his needs. Young white athletes who have great bodies and can survive doing dangerous acrobatics plus have acting ability. That's the reason the demands are so great on the younger WWF stars. The WWF doesn't want to be like the NFL or the NBA, which is so heavily black, which I'd say, based on natural and chemically unaided talent, is now nature made us. Wrestling, unlike a big man and fast man sports, is flexible. It can satisfy both the right and left-wing myths. All men are equal, depending on who can draw the most fans. The better man in wrestling is the man who can sell the most tickets. Brian Pillman wanted his day in the sun. Maybe he was as intoxicated with the ring as Sugar Ray Leonard and Robinson. Leonard quit before he became brain dead. Robinson and Jerry Quarry didn't and died pretty young. Pillman was a wannabe star, an FL aspirant with high zeal, but not a big enough body. If he had been truly wise, he'd have changed careers and worked a dipshit job like I do, and most of us do, and he'd still be alive today. Michael Abbey. Fairfield, Maine. WCW. I know storylines don't matter in WCW, but Kevin Nash lost clean to Bill Goldberg. The last time he held the title, he lost on purpose to Hulk Hogan. Then he gets a title shot. This guy is so bad as a booker and the product has deteriorated so quickly and so noticeably under his watch. It's amazing that he hasn't been replaced. If, as he claims, it's going to take 12 to 18 months to turn WCW around, then what is his long-term plan that he's building toward? What is his well-thought-out strategy he's starting that will regain the top spot? Brian Durfler. San Rafael, California.